It began not on a battlefield, but in the architecture of terror. The formation that would become the 3rd SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf, was not born from military tradition or professional soldiering. It emerged from concentration camp guards, political enforcers, and men selected not for tactical brilliance, but for ideological hardness. Its symbol, the death's head, was not metaphor. It was intent made visible. From the beginning, Totenkopf existed outside the moral boundaries that normally restrain armies. Its early members had already learned to dehumanize. They had already learned obedience without question. They had already learned that violence required no justification beyond command. When war expanded, that mindset moved from camps into open combat. In the early campaigns, Totenkopf fought with discipline and cohesion, but also with cruelty that distinguished it even among SS formations. Prisoners were executed, civilians were brutalized, fear followed its movements like a shadow. These actions were not aberrations caused by chaos. They reflected the unit's origin and culture, reinforced by leadership that viewed mercy as weakness. On the Western Front in 1940, Totenkopf proved both effective and ruthless. It advanced with determination and absorbed casualties without breaking. At the same time, massacres of captured soldiers marked its path. The division's reputation hardened quickly, respected by some commanders for its tenacity, feared by enemies and civilians alike for what followed in its wake. Then came the East. The invasion of the Soviet Union transformed Totenkopf into something even more dangerous. The Eastern Front was not fought as a conventional war. It was fought as a campaign of annihilation. Ideology fused with combat until the line between military action and mass murder disappeared entirely. Totenkopf participated fully. Villages were destroyed, prisoners were killed, civilians vanished. The division fought in some of the most brutal conditions imaginable: endless plains, burning summers, frozen winters that killed indiscriminately. It endured encirclement, starvation, and constant combat. At Demyansk, Totenkopf was nearly annihilated. Surrounded for months under relentless Soviet pressure, thousands died. Supplies fell from the sky. Survival became the only objective. And yet, the unit did not collapse. It hardened. After being rebuilt, Totenkopf returned to combat with new equipment and a reputation reinforced by suffering. Tanks replaced much of its earlier infantry structure, transforming it into a panzer division. The ideology remained, the methods remained, the brutality remained. At Kursk, in the greatest armored clash of the war, Totenkopf fought with skill and aggression. Its tanks advanced into minefields and anti-tank fire. Losses were heavy. Gains were limited. The offensive failed. From that moment forward, the war turned decisively against Germany. But Totenkopf continued to fight. Retreat followed retreat. Defensive battles replaced offensives. The division moved westward through collapsing fronts, absorbing replacements that could not match the experience of the fallen. Commanders changed. Equipment dwindled. Fuel ran out. Reality pressed in from every direction. In the West again, Totenkopf appeared during the Ardennes offensive, a final gamble built on speed and surprise. Winter hid movement briefly, but shortages and Allied strength quickly suffocated momentum. Once more, atrocities followed the division's presence. Once more, discipline failed where ideology overruled humanity. By the final months of the war, Totenkopf was exhausted, depleted, and surrounded by inevitability. What remained fought on not for victory, but because surrender felt impossible for men who knew what they had done. Some units disintegrated, others surrendered, many were killed. When the war ended, survivors faced trials, imprisonment, and the long reckoning of history. The 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf was not simply a combat formation. It was an extension of a system built on death. Its history cannot be separated into battlefield achievements and moral failure. They are inseparable. Its effectiveness in combat existed alongside, and often because of, its willingness to abandon restraint completely. Understanding that truth is not optional. It is essential. This is not a story of elite soldiers. It is a story of how ideology corrupts structure, how obedience becomes weaponized, how skill does not absolve guilt. Totenkopf stands as a warning, not a legacy to admire. Tonight, we return to this history not to sensationalize it and not to look away from it, but to confront it honestly. to trace how a unit formed in terror carried that terror into war, to examine how professionalism and brutality can coexist, and to remember that history demands accountability, not myth. Before we continue, I want to ask you something quiet and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has settled around you? And one final, honest invitation for tonight. If these long, unflinching journeys into difficult history help you think more carefully, reflect more deeply, or understand how such paths begin and where they lead, consider subscribing and stay with these stories, not for comfort, but for truth. March 29th, 1933. Dachau, Bavaria. A former munitions factory 10 miles northwest of Munich stands ready for its new purpose. The iron gates swing open. Guard towers cast long shadows across empty barracks that will soon hold thousands. At the entrance, workers bolt a metal sign into place. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. It's a lie, of course, but the man who will command this place doesn't deal in truth. He deals in terror. His name is Theodor Eicke, and he's been given a simple mandate from Heinrich Himmler: create a system, not just a prison, but a machine for breaking human beings. What happens here over the next 6 years will forge something unexpected. These guards, these brutal enforcers of racial ideology, will become soldiers. The death's head symbol on their collars will transfer from concentration camp gates to battlefield flags. And the world will learn that the cruelest institutions can also produce the most fanatical warriors. Theodor Eicke was not an obvious choice to command anything. Born in 1892 to a middle-class family in Alsace, he'd failed at nearly everything he attempted. The German army discharged him during World War I for what they delicately termed mental instability. He couldn't hold civilian jobs. His marriage was troubled. His temper was volcanic. But the Nazi Party saw potential where others saw dysfunction. In 1928, Eicke joined the SS, that elite guard formation Heinrich Himmler was building into something more than just Hitler's bodyguards. Here, finally, was an organization that valued Eicke's particular talents: absolute obedience, ideological purity, and a capacity for violence without hesitation or remorse. When the Nazis seized power in January 1933, Himmler needed men to run the concentration camps sprouting across Germany. Eicke's instability became an asset. Dachau was the laboratory. Within months of taking command, Eicke created what he called the Dachau School, a systematic approach to domination. Guards learned that prisoners were not humans but enemies of the state who deserved no mercy. Physical brutality was encouraged. Arbitrary punishment was policy. The goal was psychological destruction. Every aspect of camp life was designed to dehumanize. The striped uniforms, the capo system that turned prisoners against each other, the random beatings, the public executions. Eicke codified it all in written regulations. This wasn't sadism for its own sake, though sadism flourished. This was ideological conditioning. Guards learned to see certain categories of people: Jews, communists, Roma, homosexuals, the disabled, as subhuman threats requiring elimination. By October 1934, Eicke's methods impressed Himmler so much that he promoted him to inspector of concentration camps and SS guard formations. Now Eicke could spread his system across Germany. The organization he built became known as the SS Totenkopf, the Death's Head units, named for the skull symbol they wore. By 1938, approximately 6,500 men served in these formations, guarding 6 major concentration camps and numerous smaller facilities. They were young, averaging 23 years old. Most came from working-class backgrounds. Many were unemployed before joining. The SS offered steady pay, housing, a sense of purpose, and membership in an elite. The ideological training was relentless. 6 hours per week of lectures on racial theory, the Jewish threat, the nobility of the SS mission. This was double the indoctrination time given to regular Wehrmacht soldiers. And unlike the army, where traditional military codes still held some sway, the Totenkopf operated outside normal legal constraints. Camp guards answered only to the SS. They could kill with impunity. And they did. November 9th through 10th, 1938. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across Germany and Austria, Nazi mobs destroyed Jewish businesses, burned synagogues, murdered 91 Jews in the streets. In the aftermath, the SS Totenkopf Verbände received urgent orders: arrest 30,000 Jewish men. The concentration camps, designed for perhaps 15,000 inmates total, suddenly had to absorb double that number virtually overnight. Dachau alone received over 10,000 Jewish prisoners in 72 hours. The guards, Eicke's trained enforcers, managed this human avalanche with brutal efficiency. Prisoners were beaten upon arrival. Those who couldn't keep up during forced marches were shot. The death rate in Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen spiked dramatically in November and December 1938. Yet from the SS perspective, the operation was a success. The Totenkopf Verbände had proven they could handle massive, rapid operations involving thousands of victims. It was, in a dark sense, a dress rehearsal. By early 1939, Europe stood on the edge of war. Adolf Hitler had already absorbed Austria and dismembered Czechoslovakia. Poland would be next. The Wehrmacht was expanding rapidly, preparing for conquest. And Heinrich Himmler saw an opportunity. His SS had grown from Hitler's personal bodyguard into a state within a state: the SD intelligence service, the Gestapo secret police, the concentration camp system, and small armed SS formations that had fought alongside the army in Austria and Czechoslovakia. Now Himmler wanted full SS combat divisions. Hitler, who distrusted the conservative Wehrmacht officer corps, agreed. But where would the manpower come from? The answer was obvious: the concentration camps. In spring 1939, Himmler ordered Eicke to transform 3 SS Totenkopf Standarten, regiment-sized formations of camp guards, into the nucleus of a combat division. The idea was extraordinary and disturbing. These were not soldiers being asked to perform security duties. These were concentration camp guards being trained for war. Most had never experienced combat. Their expertise lay in dominating unarmed prisoners, not fighting armed enemies. Yet they possessed certain qualities the SS valued: ideological fanaticism, immunity to moral constraints, youth, physical fitness, and absolute obedience to SS leadership. Eicke threw himself into the transformation. He would command this new division himself. He insisted on maintaining the Death's Head symbol. The same skull badge worn by camp guards would now be worn in battle. The very name embodied this fusion. SS Totenkopf Division, the Death's Head Division. It would be different from the other S formations being created. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was Hitler's personal guard, aristocratic and showy. The SS Verfügungstruppe was being built along conventional military lines. But Totenkopf would be Eicke's creation, stamped with his personality and his methods. October 16, 1939. 6 weeks after Germany invaded Poland and started World War II, the SS Totenkopf Division officially formed at Dachau. Approximately 14,000 men assembled. Many were transferred directly from camp guard duty. Others were new SS volunteers. The ceremony was pure theater: torchlight, banners bearing the Death's Head, speeches about racial destiny and loyalty unto death. Heinrich Himmler attended. So did high-ranking Wehrmacht officers, watching uneasily. The Army High Command had already complained about SS formations. They were poorly disciplined by Wehrmacht standards. They took unnecessary casualties due to fanaticism. They committed atrocities that embarrassed Germany internationally. The Le Paradis massacre in France would soon confirm those fears, but Hitler supported Himmler's project. The SS would have its divisions, and Totenkopf would be among the first. What made Totenkopf different wasn't just its origin in the camp system. It was the culture Eicke deliberately cultivated. He rejected traditional military hierarchy and protocol. Officers were not gentlemen in the Prussian tradition, but political soldiers who enforced ideology as much as tactics. Discipline was brutal. Eicke personally approved executions of SS men for cowardice or defeatism. Yet, paradoxically, he fostered intense loyalty by positioning Totenkopf as outsiders despised by the Wehrmacht establishment. He told his men they were misunderstood, that only they truly grasped what this racial war required, that they would prove themselves through blood. Its was a gangster's mentality applied to military organization. The division became a closed society, with its own rules, contemptuous of outsiders, bound by shared secrets and shared crimes. The concentration camp had been their university. Now the battlefield would be their proving ground. As 1939 ended and 1940 began, the Totenkopf division prepared for its first test. They trained in Bavaria through a harsh winter. Equipment was scarce. Many soldiers carried captured Czech rifles and Polish weapons. The Wehrmacht, prioritizing its own units, gave Totenkopf the leftovers. Eicke raged against this disrespect, but also used it to fuel his narrative. They were the SS, the true believers, who would triumph despite being denied resources. The concentration camp guards were learning infantry tactics, weapons handling, combined arms coordination. Some adapted quickly, others struggled with the difference between terrorizing prisoners and fighting soldiers. But all of them absorbed Eicke's core message. They were racial warriors in an existential struggle where normal rules did not apply. Mercy was weakness. Hesitation was betrayal. Victory justified any method. When they finally went to war in May 1940, they would bring the concentration camp with them. The skull badge was not just a symbol, it was a promise. January 5, 1940. Dachau training grounds, 3 kilometers south of the concentration camp. Snow falls on men crawling under barbed wire, while machine guns fire live ammunition inches above their heads. This is not a malfunction. This is Theodor Eicke's idea of proper training. 14 SS recruits have already been wounded by training accidents this month. 3 have died. Eicke considers this acceptable. His officers report the casualties with the same detached efficiency they once used to report dead prisoners. The recruits, many just 18 or 19 years old, are learning what Totenkopf means. They're learning that their lives matter less than the mission, that pain is instructive, that the Führer's enemies deserve no quarter because the enemy shows none, except the enemy hasn't actually shot at them yet. That will come in 5 months, in France. For now, the enemy is the cold, the exhaustion, the live rounds cracking overhead, and Theodor Eicke himself. Eicke's training philosophy was brutally simple. Sweat saves blood, but ideology makes warriors. He divided his time between tactical instruction and political indoctrination. Morning sessions focused on weapons, tactics, and coordination between infantry, artillery, and supporting elements. The division was being built as a combined arms force, not just riflemen, but also artillery batteries, anti-tank companies, reconnaissance battalions, combat engineers. Much of this was standard military training, copied from Wehrmacht manuals. Where Totenkopf diverged was in the relentless ideological conditioning. Every afternoon included mandatory lectures on racial theory, the Jewish Bolshevik threat, the nobility of sacrifice for the folk. 6 hours per week of indoctrination compared to 2 hours in standard Wehrmacht units. SS chaplains preached that this would be a war without mercy, that conventional morality was a liberal weakness, that Germany's enemies understood only force. The recruits themselves were remarkably young. The average age in early 1940 was 21, making Totenkopf the youngest division in the SS and one of the youngest in the entire Wehrmacht. About 40% were transfers from the Totenkopf-Verbände concentration camp guards, bringing their expertise in cruelty and their contempt for human rights. The remaining 60% were new volunteers, often unemployed working-class youths drawn by SS mystique and guaranteed employment. Many had been Hitler Youth members, raised on Nazi ideology since childhood. They were physically fit, ideologically committed, and utterly inexperienced in actual warfare. Eicke needed to transform these young fanatics into combat soldiers before the invasion of France, which everyone knew was coming soon. He had perhaps 4 months. It wasn't enough time, but Eicke wasn't interested in excuses. Training took place in conditions that would horrify professional military men. Live-fire exercises had minimal safety protocols. Men learned to assault enemy positions by running toward machine gun nests, firing real ammunition. The logic was that experiencing actual incoming fire would inoculate them against panic. The cost was steady casualties. January through April 1940, the division suffered 16 deaths and 87 serious wounds during training. Normal armies would have considered this scandalous. Eicke considered it proof his methods worked. The weak were being culled, the strong were being hardened. He openly told recruits that some would die in training, and this was preferable to dying uselessly in Sarut. Combat. There was a Darwinian brutality to the whole enterprise. Totenkopf was not trying to preserve every soldier. It was trying to create a core of survivors who could endure anything. Equipment was a constant frustration. The Wehrmacht, which controlled armaments distribution, had little love for the SS. The army's attitude was that Hitler's political soldiers should receive political weapons, which is to say, leftovers. Totenkopf was initially equipped with a chaotic mix of captured Czech Vizin 24 rifles, Polish Mausers seized during the September campaign, and a smattering of German weapons. Heavy weapons were even more scarce. The division's anti-tank company had to make do with 37mm guns that were already obsolete. Soviet and French tanks could shrug off their rounds. Artillery was a mix of German and Czech pieces with incompatible ammunition. Half-tracks were in chronically short supply. Eicke complained bitterly to Himmler, who complained to Hitler, who occasionally intervened to shake loose some equipment, but the message was clear. Totenkopf would have to prove itself before it received first-rate weapons. This material deprivation fed Eicke's narrative of persecution and superiority. He told his officers they were being sabotaged by jealous Wehrmacht generals who feared the SS. He told his men they would triumph despite inferior equipment because their ideology was superior. Every shortage became evidence of their outsider status, their revolutionary character, their opposition to the stale military establishment. Eicke consciously created a siege mentality within his own division. They were surrounded by enemies, the Western democracies, the Bolsheviks, the Jews, and even the Wehrmacht traditionalists who looked down on them. Only absolute unity and fanatical determination would see them through. It was a toxic but effective psychology. The young S-men began to see themselves as a warrior brotherhood, bound by shared hardship and shared mission. By February 1940, Eicke began receiving reports that concerned even him. Several of his officers reported that recruits, particularly those with concentration camp backgrounds, were showing excessive aggression towards civilians in nearby towns. There were incidents, SS men beating civilians for perceived disrespect, sexual assaults on young women, theft, drunken violence. The local Nazi Party leadership complained to Himmler. What's remarkable is not that these incidents occurred. Wehrmacht troops also behaved badly sometimes, but Eicke's response. He did not crack down hard. He gave speeches about maintaining SS honor, then quietly told his officers that such warrior spirits were exactly what the division needed. A few men were disciplined for appearance's sake, but the message to the rank and file was clear. Aggression would be tolerated, even encouraged, as long as it was directed at the right targets. The final phase of training involved large-scale exercises simulating division-level operations. In March and April 1940, Totenkopf participated in war games with Wehrmacht units in Bavaria and Austria. The performance was mixed. Coordination between different battalion-level elements was often chaotic. Communications broke down repeatedly. Supply lines failed. The reconnaissance battalion got hopelessly lost during one exercise. Wehrmacht observers wrote scathing reports. The division was poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and likely to suffer heavy casualties in real combat. They were not entirely wrong. Totenkopf was not ready for war by professional military standards. But Eicke didn't care about professional military standards. He cared about will. He believed ideological commitment could compensate for tactical deficiency. His men might not know proper radio procedure, but they would charge machine gun nests. They might lack armored vehicles, but they wouldn't retreat. It was a gamble. War would reveal whether fanaticism could substitute for training. April 19th of 40. With the invasion of France approaching, Himmler visited Totenkopf for a final inspection. He reviewed 14,000 men standing in perfect formation. The Death's Head flag snapped in the spring wind. Eicke had assembled what looked like a proper military division: 3 infantry regiments totaling 9 battalions, 1 artillery regiment with 36 guns, 1 reconnaissance battalion, 1 anti-tank battalion, 1 engineer battalion, 1 signals battalion, various support elements. On paper, it resembled a Wehrmacht infantry division. In reality, it was something different. These were not professional soldiers following a military tradition dating back to Frederick the Great. These were ideological warriors following Theodor Eicke, a failed clerk turned concentration camp commandant turned division commander. They wore the death's head. They sang SS songs about racial purity and Jewish assault, destruction. They had been taught that mercy was weakness and that their enemies, defined racially and politically, deserved extermination. Himmler gave a speech. He told them they were the future, that the Wehrmacht represented the past, that history would remember them as the vanguard of the new Germany. He said the coming campaign would test them, that some would die, that this was necessary and glorious. The young SS men cheered. Many genuinely believed they were embarking on a holy mission. Some were simply excited for adventure. A few of the concentration camp veterans knew exactly what they were capable of and looked forward to applying those skills in a new context. Within 3 weeks, they would cross into Belgium and France. Within 5 weeks, they would commit their first major war crime. The training was complete. The beast had been forged. Now it was time to see what it would do. May 10th, 1940, 05:30 hours. German-Belgian border near Aachen. The pre-dawn darkness, thousands of artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The earth shakes. The sky turns orange. Operation Yellow has begun. Hitler's long-awaited invasion of France and the Low Countries. Among the German formations pouring across the border is the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, finally going to war. In their half-tracks and trucks, young SS men clutch their rifles and watch the artillery barrage light up the horizon. Some are terrified, some are exhilarated, most are simply numb with anticipation. They've trained for this moment for 6 months. They've been told they're the elite, the ideological vanguard, the true inheritors of Germany's warrior tradition. Now they'll find out if ideology can stop bullets. Within 17 days, they'll know the answer. And within 17 days, they'll also prove that the concentration camp mentality travels easily from guard tower to battlefield. The first days of combat were a shock. Totenkopf crossed into Belgium as part of Army Group B, tasked with supporting the Wehrmacht's advance through the Low Countries, while the main thrust went through the Ardennes. The division's mission was to advance, engage enemy forces, and prevent a coherent Allied defense. Simple enough in theory. In practice, everything was chaos. The roads were clogged with refugees fleeing westward. Supply trucks couldn't keep up with the advancing infantry. Radio communications failed constantly. The first firefight occurred near the town of Cambrai on May 13th, when Totenkopf reconnaissance elements ran into French colonial troops. The brief battle left 11 SS men dead and 23 wounded. It was the division's first taste of blood. The shock wasn't the casualties. Eicke had warned them to expect losses. The shock was that the enemy shot back effectively. These weren't unarmed concentration camp prisoners. These were soldiers with rifles and artillery who fought hard before withdrawing. May 21st, 1940, near Arras, France. The division encountered something they'd never trained for: British Matilda tanks. These heavily armored vehicles, nearly immune to German 37mm anti-tank guns, smashed through Totenkopf positions during the British counterattack at Arras. SS infantrymen fired uselessly at the Matildas as they rolled over trenches and crushed machine gun nests. Panic spread through the ranks. For the first time, SS ideology met industrial reality. Believing in racial superiority doesn't help when a 40-ton tank is bearing down on you and your weapon can't penetrate its armor. The division's lines buckled. Men retreated without orders. The situation was saved only when Wehrmacht units with better anti-tank weapons arrived to blunt the British attack. By day's end, Totenkopf had suffered 39 killed, over 200 wounded, and an unspecified number missing. But worse than the casualties was the humiliation. They'd nearly broken. Theodor Eicke's response was characteristically brutal. That evening, he assembled his officers and launched into a tirade about cowardice and betrayal of the SS ideal. He demanded names of men who'd retreated without orders. Over the next 48 hours, 16 SS soldiers were arrested and brought before summary courts-martial. The charges were abandoning positions and defeatism. The trials, if they can be called that, lasted minutes each. 16 men were found guilty. 16 men were executed by firing squad, their bodies left on display as warnings. This was Eicke's logic. If British tanks instilled fear, then SS justice must instill greater fear. Better to be shot by your own side for retreating than to retreat and face the enemy. It was concentration camp discipline applied to military operations. And it worked, in its horrifying way. The message was received. Totenkopf would not tolerate failure. Soldiers who might have fled in future battles instead stood and fought, not because they were brave, but because they feared Eicke more than they feared the enemy. The breakthrough came in late May as the Allied defensive line collapsed. Totenkopf, now advancing rapidly through northern France, encountered scattered British and French units conducting fighting retreats. These were chaotic, bitter engagements where small groups of Allied soldiers would delay the German advance for hours before being overwhelmed or withdrawing. It was in this context, frustration, casualties, rapid advances, disorganized enemy resistance, that the division's true nature emerged. Near the village of Le Paradis on May 27th, elements of the 2nd Company, 4th Infantry Regiment encountered stubborn resistance from British troops of the Royal Norfolk Regiment. The British, outnumbered and running low on ammunition, defended a farmhouse for hours, inflicting casualties on the attacking SS troops. The fight was sharp and professional. The British were doing exactly what rearguard actions are supposed to do: delay the enemy and inflict losses. Eventually, the British position became untenable. Ammunition exhausted, approximately 100 men of the Royal Norfolk Regiment surrendered to the SS forces surrounding them. They emerged from the farmhouse with hands raised, expecting to be taken prisoner. This is where the concentration camp mentality revealed itself. SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Knochlein, commanding the German troops, was enraged. His unit had suffered casualties taking the farmhouse. He'd lost men. His professional pride, such as it was, had been wounded by the British resistance. In his mind, soldiers who fought hard before surrendering were not brave enemies worthy of respect. They were partisans, francs tireurs, illegal combatants who deserved death. It's unclear whether Knochlein ordered the massacre on his own initiative or whether he was following the division's informal culture. Either way, what happened next was methodical. The 97 British prisoners were marched to a nearby meadow. There, 2 MG-34 machine guns had been set up, carefully positioned for overlapping fields of fire. The British soldiers, realizing what was about to happen, had no time to resist. The machine guns opened fire. Men fell in waves. The shooting continued for several minutes until all the prisoners were down. Then SS troops moved through the pile of bodies with bayonets, stabbing anyone who showed signs of life. It was efficient. It was practiced. It had the feel of something rehearsed, though whether the rehearsal happened at Dachau or in earlier, smaller incidents is unknown. Miraculously, 2 men survived, Private Albert Pooley and Private William O'Callaghan. Both were wounded but played dead. After the SS troops left, French civilians from Le Paradis found them and hid them until they could receive medical care. Those 2 survivors would eventually testify at Knochlein's war crimes trial in 1948. Le Paradis was not an isolated incident. In the last week of May 1940, Wehrmacht officers began documenting other Totenkopf killings. Near Bethune, SS troops executed approximately 40 French colonial soldiers, Senegalese troops from French West Africa, who had surrendered. Near Abbeville, witnesses reported the shooting of British prisoners. The pattern was clear. Totenkopf treated surrender differently than Wehrmacht units did. In the SS worldview, particularly Eicke's worldview, enemy soldiers who inflicted casualties forfeited the right to quarter. This was the concentration camp logic applied to war. Prisoners were not humans with rights, but defeated enemies to be disposed of. General Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group B, was horrified. He filed an official protest with Wehrmacht High Command, documenting at least 8 separate incidents of prisoner killings by Totenkopf troops. The report went nowhere. SS formations answered to Himmler, not the Bull, army, and Hitler saw no reason to discipline the SS for being too hard on the enemy. By mid-June 1940, France was collapsing. The British had evacuated at Dunkirk. The French government was fleeing Paris. Totenkopf continued advancing, now mostly unopposed. The division had suffered 1,140 killed and 2,620 wounded during the 6-week campaign, high casualties for what amounted to supporting operations. But they'd proven themselves in Himmler's eyes. They'd fought, they'd advanced, they'd shown the toughness the SS prized. The war crimes were, from the SS perspective, evidence of ideological commitment. Eicke was promoted to SS Brigadeführer und Generalmajor der Waffen-SS. His division received commendations, and the crucial lesson was learned. You could massacre prisoners and face no consequences. Wehrmacht generals might protest, but Hitler and Himmler would protect their SS warriors. It was a green light. What Totenkopf had done in France was merely prologue to what they would do in the East. July 8, 1940. Bordeaux, southwestern France. The war in the West is over. France has surrendered. Britain stands alone. And the 3rd SS Division Totenkopf finds itself assigned to occupation duty in the Bordeaux region, garrisoning a defeated country while Hitler plans his next move. For a formation built on ideology and bloodshed, peacetime is poison. The Death's Head soldiers, average age 21, occupy French towns where resentment simmers beneath forced civility. They are young men with rifles, power, and few constraints. The French civilians are defeated people trying to survive under occupation. It's an inherently unstable situation. Within weeks, the complaints begin: theft, assault, unauthorized requisitions, sexual violence. The French authorities file 127 formal complaints with German occupation headquarters by November. The response is minimal. These are SS men, after all. And they're bored. Boredom, for a force trained in cruelty, is dangerous. Theodor Eicke was perhaps more frustrated than anyone. He'd built Totenkopf for war, not garrison duty. The division's purpose was combat, conquest, the violent expansion of Germany's racial empire. Instead, his men were checking papers at roadblocks and patrolling quiet villages. It was humiliating. Worse, it was corroding discipline. The very qualities that made Totenkopf effective in battle, aggression, contempt for rules, ideological fanaticism, became liabilities in occupation. A soldier trained to see enemies everywhere naturally creates enemies everywhere. Eicke watched his division deteriorate through summer and fall, 1940. Drunkenness increased. Brawls between SS men became common. Small-scale corruption flourished. The concentration camp guards who'd become soldiers were reverting to their worst habits: petty tyranny, casual brutality, theft from those they controlled. It was Dachau with wine rations. The desertion incident in September shocked even Eicke. 23 SS soldiers, mostly young recruits who'd joined after the French campaign, attempted to flee to Spain. Their plan was to reach the Spanish border, cross into neutral territory, and somehow make their way to Britain or America. It was hopelessly naive. The SS's internal security apparatus caught them within 48 hours. 4 were shot during apprehension. The remaining 19 were brought back to division headquarters in chains. Eicke convened courts-martial immediately. The sentence was predetermined: death for all. But Himmler, concerned about public relations and recruitment, commuted most sentences to long prison terms. Only the 4 ringleaders were executed. Still, the incident revealed troubling truths. Totenkopf's ideological cohesion was weaker than Eicke believed. Young men who'd been swept up in Nazi fervor during wartime could experience doubt during peace. So, victory over France hadn't delivered the promised utopia. Instead, it delivered boring garrison duty in a country where everyone hated you. Eicke needed a new mission. Throughout fall 1940, he bombarded Himmler with requests for combat assignments. He sent memoranda directly to Hitler, bypassing Wehrmacht channels. He argued that the SS was wasted on occupation duty, that Totenkopf's special qualities required employment in active operations. What those special qualities were, Eicke didn't specify, probably because spelling out trained in concentration camp methods wouldn't sound good in official communications. But Hitler and Himmler understood the subtext. The SS divisions were ideological instruments for racial war. France was conquered. Britain was being bombed but not invaded. That left only one target that required ideological warriors: the Soviet Union. By November 1940, Eicke knew where Totenkopf was going next. The details were secret, but the direction was clear: east. Preparation for the Eastern Campaign began quietly in late 1940. The division was pulled back from forward occupation zones to training areas near Bordeaux. New equipment arrived: more trucks, better radios, additional artillery pieces. Finally, Totenkopf was receiving the material support the Wehrmacht had denied earlier. The reason was simple: Hitler was planning the largest military operation in history, and he needed every available division. Totenkopf would be part of Army Group North, tasked with advancing through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. The mission profile was different from France. This wouldn't be a lightning campaign against an unprepared enemy. Soviet intelligence knew war was coming. The Red Army, despite Stalin's purges, remained enormous, and the distances involved were vast. France from border to Paris was roughly 500 kilometers. The Soviet Union stretched 5,000 kilometers from Poland to the Pacific. Personnel changes accompanied the new equipment. The Les Paradis massacre, while not prosecuted, had become politically embarrassing. Foreign journalists had reported on it. The International Red Cross was asking questions. Himmler quietly ordered Eicke to transfer certain officers out of the division. Fritz Knocklein and several other participants in the massacre were reassigned to training commands or rear area units. This wasn't punishment, it was protective custody. The SS couldn't afford a war crimes trial while they were preparing for a new invasion. Simultaneously, 1,200 men were transferred out and 2,800 new recruits arrived. The division was being refreshed, diluting the concentration of camp guards with fresh volunteers who had no knowledge of France. It was a calculated move to reduce institutional memory of war crimes while maintaining the division's ideological character. The ideological preparation intensified in early 1941. Every week included mandatory lectures on Jewish Bolshevism, the theory that communism was a Jewish conspiracy to destroy Aryan civilization. SS chaplains preached that the coming war would be different from the fight in France. This would be a racial war, a war of extermination where normal rules didn't apply. The enemy wasn't just the Red Army, but the entire Soviet population, infected by Jewish communist ideology. Prisoners could not be trusted. Civilians might be partisans. Every Soviet commissar, the Communist Party political officers attached to Red Army units, was to be shot on sight. This was the Commissar Order, issued by Wehrmacht High Command in March 1941, and embraced enthusiastically by the SS. Totenkopf soldiers attended special screenings showing propaganda films about Soviet atrocities and Jewish control of the Kremlin. The message was unsubtle: you're going to kill, a lot. And it's not just acceptable, it's necessary. April 1941, final preparations. The division conducted large-scale exercises simulating Soviet defensive positions. New tactics were drilled: combined arms assaults, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, anti-partisan operations in rear areas. That last phrase, anti-partisan, was deliberately vague. In Wehrmacht doctrine, it meant hunting armed resistance fighters. In SS interpretation, it meant something far broader. Anyone who opposed German occupation could be labeled a partisan. Soviet officials, Communist Party members, Jews, intellectuals, anyone who seemed hostile, all partisans. And partisans were not soldiers with rights under international law. They were illegal combatants who could be shot on the spot. Eicke made sure his men understood this. The Eastern Front would not repeat France's mistakes. There would be no prisoners to file war crimes complaints afterward. May 1941. Totenkopf moved east by rail, traveling through Germany and occupied Poland toward the Soviet border. The division's strength stood at approximately 14,000 men, organized into 3 infantry regiments, 1 artillery regiment, various support battalions. They were better equipped than they'd been in France, though still not up to Wehrmacht standards. More importantly, they were psychologically prepared for what was coming. The young SS soldiers had been told repeatedly that this would be a war without mercy, that the enemy deserved extermination, that their task was as much racial cleansing as military conquest. They'd been trained for 6 months to see Soviet citizens as subhuman. Some believed it completely. Some were simply indifferent. They'd follow orders, whatever those orders were. And a very few, felt the first stirrings of doubt. But doubt was dangerous in the SS. So, they kept quiet, checked their weapons, and waited for the order to cross the border. They would not wait long. June 22, 1941, 03:15 hours. Soviet border. East Prussia. The artillery barrage begins exactly on schedule. 3,000 German guns open fire, along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It's the largest military operation in human history. Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German troops are crossing the Soviet border. Among them, attached to Army Group North, is the 3rd SS Division Totenkopf. They cross before dawn, advancing into Lithuanian territory, behind screens of Wehrmacht infantry and armor. The scale is beyond anything they experienced in France. Entire Soviet divisions are being encircled. Thousands of prisoners stream westward. The Luftwaffe dominates the skies. In the first hours, it feels like France all over again. Easy victories, rapid advances, a collapsing enemy. But Soviet Russia is not France. The Russians will fight differently. They'll die differently. And by winter, the question won't be how far the Germans can advance, but whether they can survive. The first serious combat came at Raseiniai, Lithuania, on June 23rd. Totenkopf, advancing as part of the 4th Panzer Group, ran into Soviet armor, specifically KV-1 and KV-2 heavy tanks that the Germans didn't know existed. These monsters, weighing 45 and 52 tons respectively, were nearly invulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. Totenkopf's 37mm guns bounced rounds off KV armor like pebbles. Even the 50mm guns of Wehrmacht Panzer units struggled. One KV-2 tank, crewed by 5 Soviet soldiers, held up the entire Totenkopf advance for 48 hours. It positioned itself on a critical road junction and destroyed 12 German vehicles, half-tracks, trucks, light tanks, while shrugging off German fire. The SS troops tried everything: direct assault, flanking maneuvers, calling in airstrikes. Nothing worked. The KV's 76mm gun had massive range and hitting power. Finally, on June 25th, German engineers crawled close enough under cover of darkness to plant explosive charges. The tank was destroyed, its crew dead inside. The Battle of Raseiniai, which lasted from June 23rd to 27th, cost Totenkopf dearly. 2,000 casualties in 4 days, killed, wounded, and missing. It was their first encounter with Soviet operational doctrine: defense in depth, heavy armor, willingness to accept catastrophic losses to delay the enemy. The Red Army units at Raseiniai were eventually encircled and destroyed, but they'd bought time and inflicted real damage. For the SS men of Totenkopf, it shattered illusions. The racial ideology they'd absorbed suggested Slavs were inferior, barely human, incapable of sophisticated resistance. Yet, here were Soviet tank crews fighting their machines to destruction, Soviet infantrymen counterattacking against hopeless odds, Soviet artillery pounding German positions with professional competence. The cognitive dissonance was severe. If the enemy was subhuman, why were they so hard to kill? The answer, for many SS men, was to deny the contradiction by escalating brutality. If the enemy fought harder than expected, it proved they were dangerous and therefore deserving of extermination. This circular logic, resistance justifies brutality, which provokes more resistance, which justifies more brutality, defined Totenkopf's conduct through summer and fall 1941. By early July, the division had advanced deep into Lithuania and was entering Russia proper, near the town of Demyansk. Here, the landscape changed. Endless forests, primitive roads, villages of log houses, swamps that swallowed vehicles. And here the massacres began in earnest. Unlike France, where killing prisoners was opportunistic, in the Soviet Union it became systematic. The Commissar order was implemented with enthusiasm. Every Soviet political officer captured was immediately shot. But Totenkopf went further. Soviet Jews in uniform were shot. Soviet soldiers who resisted, tooth as hard, were shot. Soviet civilians suspected of partisan sympathy were shot. July 1941, near Demyansk. Totenkopf conducted its first major anti-partisan operation. Intelligence reports suggested Soviet partisans were operating from villages in the rear areas, ambushing supply convoys. Eicke ordered the 2nd Infantry Regiment to pacify the region. What followed was not a military operation, but a massacre. SS troops surrounded the village of Dubno, which had a large Jewish population. Over 3 days, approximately 2,500 people were killed. Men shot, women and children either shot or locked, in buildings that were then burned. The justification was that the village had harbored partisans. No evidence of partisan activity was ever produced. The reality was that this was the concentration camp methodology applied to occupied territory. Totenkopf had learned in training that certain categories of people, Jews especially, could be killed without consequence. Now they were applying that lesson in a combat zone. The killing in the Demyansk region continued through July and August. Historical documentation is incomplete because Totenkopf, unlike Wehrmacht units, kept minimal records of anti-civilian operations. But Soviet investigators after the war, cross-referencing witness testimony and German documents, estimated that in July and August 1941, Totenkopf forces killed between 6,000 and 8,000 civilians in their zone of operations. Most were Jews. Many were women, children, and elderly people. Some were genuine Soviet partisan supporters, but the vast majority were simply people who lived in areas the division controlled and belonged to groups the SS considered subhuman. The line between combat operations and genocide had completely dissolved. Totenkopf soldiers would spend the morning fighting Red Army troops and the afternoon executing Jewish civilians. For them, these were different aspects of the same mission, destroying the Jewish Bolshevik enemy. The Valdai Hills operation in August illustrated how completely military and genocidal functions had merged. Soviet forces were conducting stubborn resistance in the Valdai uplands southwest of Leningrad. Totenkopf was tasked with clearing the area. The division conducted a sweep operation, infantry advancing in lines, searching every village, capturing or killing Soviet soldiers. But the operation simultaneously targeted civilians. 23 villages were burned. All males over 15 were executed as potential partisans, approximately 1,800 men and boys. Women and children were sometimes released, sometimes shipped to forced labor camps, sometimes killed if resources were limited. The rationale was purely ideological. This area would be part of the new German Lebensraum, so the existing population needed to be eliminated or enslaved. It was genocide masquerading as counterinsurgency. By September 1941, Totenkopf reached the outskirts of Leningrad. The division participated in the encirclement of the city, which would be besieged for 900 days. Here they transitioned from mobile warfare to static siege operations. It was brutal, grinding combat, trench raids, sniper duels, artillery bombardments, Soviet counterattacks seeking to break the siege. Casualties mounted steadily, but even in defensive positions, the killing of non-combatants continued. Soviet POWs were routinely executed rather than being sent to camps. Of the 8,200 Red Army prisoners taken by Totenkopf in the first 3 months of Barbarossa, only 347 reached POW camps. The rest were shot, worked to death, or simply left to die of exposure and starvation. This was not anomalous. Wehrmacht units also treated Soviet prisoners with murderous neglect. But Totenkopf went further, faster, with less hesitation. The treatment of Soviet POWs revealed the complete breakdown of military ethics. International law, specifically the Geneva Convention, required humane treatment of prisoners. In practice, Germany did not extend Geneva protections to Soviet prisoners, arguing that the USSR hadn't signed certain protocols. But even by Germany's own military code, the mass execution of prisoners was illegal. It didn't matter. Totenkopf operated under SS jurisdiction, not Wehrmacht law, and the SS had made clear that this was a racial war where normal rules were suspended. Eicke personally signed orders mandating that Soviet commissars be executed immediately and that partisans, defined so broadly as to include almost any civilian, had no rights. These were not rogue commanders acting on their own. This was institutional policy from the top of the SS command structure. By October 1941, the division was spent. 4 months of continuous combat had reduced Totenkopf from 14,000 men to approximately 4,500 effectives. 7,000 were dead. The rest were wounded, sick, or missing. Vehicles were destroyed or broken down. Equipment was worn out. The Russian winter was approaching, and Germany had made no preparation for winter warfare. The assumption had been that the Soviet Union would collapse in weeks, like France. Instead, the Red Army was still fighting, Moscow still stood, and Leningrad remained uncaptured despite being surrounded. Totenkopf, like the entire German war effort, was stalled. In November, Eicke's division was pulled from the Leningrad front, officially for rest and refitting. The reality was that they had been bled white and needed complete reconstitution, but they had also accomplished their primary mission. They had proven that ideological warfare worked, at least in the short term. The Death's Head soldiers had killed tens of thousands of Soviet military and civilian personnel. They'd terrorized occupied territories. They'd implemented genocidal policies with efficiency. The beast had proven itself in the abyss. Now it needed to be rebuilt, because the war in the East was just beginning. November 18th, 1941, Leningrad front, minus 12 degrees Celsius. The last trucks carrying Totenkopf survivors rattle westward through snow squalls. They're leaving behind 7,000 dead comrades and a frozen hell. The division that crossed the Soviet border in June with 14,000 men now numbers 4,500 shattered survivors. They're going to France, not for conquest this time, but for rebuilding. The trains carry them west through the winter, through Poland, through Germany, into occupied France, where summer sunlight and wine await. It feels like resurrection, but this rebirth will transform them into something new. The SS hierarchy has decided Totenkopf deserves elevation. They'll return to Russia not as infantry, but as panzer grenadiers, mechanized warriors with tanks, half-tracks, and the industrial might of Germany at their backs. The concentration camp guards who became soldiers will become armored knights. Whether this makes them more or less dangerous remains to be seen. The survivors who arrived at training grounds near Bordeaux in December 1941 were physically and psychologically wrecked. Medical examinations revealed that 78% had frostbite injuries, 43% had various infections, and virtually all were malnourished and exhausted. Combat trauma was universal. SS medical officers noted abnormally high rates of anxiety reactions, sleep disturbances, and emotional volatility in the after-action reports. In civilian terms, they were describing what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, but the SS didn't have that concept in 1941. They simply noted that the men were hardened and combat experienced. Those who couldn't function were quietly transferred to rear area units. The rest were given leave, fed properly, allowed to recover. Then, the rebuilding began. The transformation from infantry to Panzer Grenadier Division was massive. Infantry divisions relied on their legs, horses, and limited motor transport. Panzer Grenadier divisions moved in armored vehicles, fought from half-tracks, and included substantial tank forces. The reorganization took 6 months, from January through June 1942. Totenkopf's 3 infantry regiments were restructured into 2 Panzer Grenadier regiments, each with 3 battalions equipped with half-tracks and armored cars. A new tank battalion was created, initially with 124 tanks, 75 Panzer III medium tanks, 49 Panzer IV medium tanks. Additionally, 35 Sturmgeschütz assault guns were added for infantry support. New artillery arrived, 18 105mm howitzers, 12 150mm howitzers. Reconnaissance elements received armored cars. Anti-tank units got better 50mm and 75mm guns. This equipment allocation was extraordinary. Wehrmacht panzer divisions, the Army's elite, were receiving similar or fewer vehicles. For an SS formation to receive priority was politically significant. It revealed Hitler's increasing reliance on ideologically loyal units versus the traditional Wehrmacht. The Army's generals noticed and resented it. General staff officers watched with barely concealed anger as precious tanks went to SS formations, while Wehrmacht units begged for replacements. But Hitler had made his decision. The SS were his Praetorian Guard, and they would get what they needed. The cost was staggering. Totenkopf's refit consumed 47 million Reichsmarks, enough to fully equip 3 Wehrmacht infantry divisions. But money was the least of Germany's concerns in 1942. The war was becoming industrial, and Germany was betting everything on quality over quantity. Training the new mechanized force presented challenges. Most SS men had never operated tanks. Tank warfare requires specialized skills, reading terrain, coordinating with infantry, maintaining mechanical systems, communicating via radio in the chaos of battle. Wehrmacht panzer crews typically received 16 weeks of intensive training. Totenkopf tank crews got 8 weeks. It was inadequate, but time was precious. The Eastern Front was consuming men and machines at catastrophic rates. Germany needed the rebuilt Totenkopf back in combat as quickly as possible, so corner-cutting was accepted. Young recruits, many only 18 years old, were given abbreviated instruction on Panzer III operation and declared combat ready. Experienced infantrymen were retrained as armored infantry, learning to fight from half-tracks. Officers attended condensed courses on mechanized operations. The entire process was rushed, improvised, and incomplete, but it was better than nothing. New personnel arrived throughout spring 1942. 2,800 fresh recruits, most of them Hitler Youth volunteers, aged 17 to 19. They were joining a division whose reputation was already fearsome within the SS. Stories from the Eastern Front had circulated: the KV tank battles, the breakout from Demyansk, the brutal anti-partisan operations. The new recruits looked up to the survivors as hardened veterans who'd seen the worst and endured. The survivors, traumatized and cynical, looked at the recruits and saw doomed children. The average age of the rebuilt division dropped to 19 and a half years, making Totenkopf even younger than it had been in 1940. But these were different young men. They'd grown up entirely under Nazi rule, educated in schools that taught racial ideology as science, indoctrinated in Hitler Youth programs that glorified death for the folk. They were perhaps more ideologically pure than the original formation, if such a thing was possible. Command changes reflected new realities. Theodor Eicke remained division commander, but he'd been forced to accept Wehrmacht liaison officers, a humiliating acknowledgement that the SS couldn't operate entirely independently. The liaison officers were professional military men, often aristocratic Prussian types, who barely concealed their contempt for the SS. They were there to coordinate with Wehrmacht units, manage logistics, and provide tactical advice. Eicke hated them. He saw them as spies from the army establishment, representatives of the old order that the SS was supposed to supersede, but he had no choice. Mechanized warfare required better coordination than infantry operations. Tanks couldn't simply charge ahead without supply lines, air support, artillery coordination. The technical complexity of mechanized operations demanded professionalism that ideology alone couldn't provide. By June 1942, the transformation was complete. The 3rd SS Division Totenkopf was officially redesignated SS Panzer Division, Totenkopf. On paper, it was now one of the most powerful formations in the German military. 16,000 men, 124 tanks, 35 assault guns, 144 half-tracks, modern artillery, excellent reconnaissance capabilities. It looked impressive in parade grounds and organizational charts. Whether it would function effectively in combat remained uncertain. The division had been rebuilt in 6 months, with abbreviated training, new equipment, inexperienced crews, and a mix of traumatized veterans and naive teenagers. But time had run out. The Eastern Front was calling, the Soviet summer offensive was building momentum, and Germany needed every available unit to stabilize the situation. In July 1942, Totenkopf entrained for the East once again. They were leaving behind French wine and sunshine. They were returning to the abyss, but this time they'd face it mounted in steel. February 8, 1942. Demyansk, northwestern, Russia. The temperature stands at -38 degrees Celsius. The Soviet winter offensive has achieved what seemed impossible, encircling 90,000 German troops in a pocket roughly 100 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide. Among the trapped forces are remnants of the Totenkopf division, still weakened from the fall campaign. They haven't yet received their mechanized upgrade. That will come in France. Right now, their infantry surrounded by angry Soviets in the worst winter in 50 years. The pocket is closing. Soviet forces are tightening the noose. Ammunition is running low. Food is scarce. The wounded are dying because there's no way to evacuate them. And overhead, in weather that should ground all aircraft, Luftwaffe transport planes are attempting something unprecedented, an aerial supply bridge into an encircled army. For 72 days, Totenkopf will be trapped. Many will die. But those who survive will emerge with a myth they held when others would have broken. They endured hell itself. The encirclement happened with stunning speed. Stalin had ordered a massive winter counteroffensive all along the German front. The goal was to replicate what had worked at Moscow, use the winter to destroy German units before they could dig in. In Army Group North's sector, Soviet forces launched multiple penetrations, encircling German positions around the town of Demyansk. By February 8th, the pocket was sealed. Inside were 6 German divisions, including the battered remains of Totenkopf, approximately 5,000 SS men who hadn't been evacuated in November. They were trapped with 85,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, all facing the same horrifying questions. Would Hitler order them to break out? Would relief columns reach them? Or would they be abandoned, like the Sixth Army would be at Stalingrad 11 months later? Hitler's decision shaped everything that followed. He refused to authorize breakout. His reasoning was part strategic, part psychological. Strategically, abandoning the Demyansk salient would straighten the front, but surrender territory. Hitler had convinced himself that holding ground was always correct, that willpower could overcome logistics. Psychologically, he couldn't bear the idea of retreat. So, the order went out: hold the pocket, supply it by air, wait for relief. The Luftwaffe was tasked with flying in 270 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, food, medicine, fuel. In February 1942, in Arctic weather, over hostile territory, this was nearly impossible. But Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler it could be done. He was lying, or deluded, or both, but his promise doomed 90,000 men to months of frozen hell. The aerial supply operation began immediately. Junkers Ju-52 transport planes, slow 3-engine workhorses, flew from German airfields into the pocket. The first flights went well. Then Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns began exacting a toll. Transports were shot down, planes crashed in blizzards. Landing strips inside the pocket, hastily scraped from snow-covered fields, became death traps as Soviet artillery targeted them. By the end of February, the Luftwaffe was losing planes faster than they could be replaced. But the flights continued, because if they stopped, 90,000 men would starve. In the end, over 72 days, the Luftwaffe delivered 24,000 tons of supplies, an incredible feat, but it cost 265 aircraft and thousands of aircrew. And it still wasn't enough. Inside the pocket, conditions were medieval. The cold was beyond what most humans can comprehend. Minus 40 degrees freezes exposed flesh in minutes. Vehicles wouldn't start. Weapons froze. Soldiers wrapped themselves in anything they could find. Blankets, rugs stripped from Russian houses, newspapers stuffed inside clothing. Frostbite was epidemic. By March, Totenkopf alone had 4,000 frostbite cases. Nearly 80% of the SS troops in the pocket required amputations of fingers, toes, or limbs. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia because supplies had run out. Men died not from wounds, but from infections that antibiotics could have prevented. The wounded were placed in unheated barns, where they froze to death slowly. It was not war. It was a frozen apocalypse. The Soviet attacks came in waves. Stalin wanted the pocket destroyed, wanted the propaganda victory of annihilating German divisions. Red Army troops assaulted the perimeter repeatedly through February, March, and April. The fighting was intimate and savage. Trenches were too frozen to dig properly, so positions were built from snow and corpses. Hand-to-hand combat happened regularly as Soviet infantry broke through German lines. Totenkopf, despite their depleted numbers and condition, held their sector through fanatical resistance. This was where Eicke's ideology showed its dark utility. SS men had been conditioned to believe surrender meant death at Soviet hands. They'd been told stories, some true, some exaggerated, about Soviet treatment of prisoners. Better to die fighting than fall into enemy hands. So, they fought. On March 15th, a major Soviet assault hit Totenkopf positions. 1,200 SS soldiers were killed in that single day, but the line held. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers kept diaries describing hallucinations, paranoia, suicidal thoughts. One SS officer wrote, "We're already dead. Our bodies just haven't admitted it yet." Men stopped caring about military discipline. Some units executed their own members for defeatism or attempted desertion, but mostly the officers looked the other way. Survival trumped ideology. The racial theories that SS Indoctrination hammered into these men seemed absurd when you're starving in a frozen trench. The enemy was not subhuman. Ideology, the enemy was cold, hunger, and artillery. Yet remarkably, the pocket held. The Germans, outnumbered roughly 2-1, maintained a cohesive defense. Soviet attacks were repelled. The perimeter contracted but didn't collapse. Relief came agonizingly slowly. Wehrmacht forces outside the pocket launched multiple attempts to break through the Soviet encirclement. Each failed with heavy casualties. Finally, on April 21st, German troops forced a narrow corridor into the pocket. It was barely 3 kilometers wide, constantly under Soviet fire, but it was open. Supplies flowed more freely. The wounded could be evacuated. The immediate crisis passed. But the pocket was not officially abandoned until early May, after 72 days of siege. The cost was staggering. Of the 90,000 German troops encircled, roughly 35,000 became casualties, dead, wounded, or captured. Totenkopf suffered 3,200 killed, 5,800 wounded, and 4,000 frostbite amputations. Over 90% of the SS men who entered the pocket left it either dead or maimed. But something unexpected emerged from the horror, a legend. Totenkopf had endured the worst the Eastern Front could offer and survived. They'd been outnumbered, undersupplied, frozen, and bombarded for months. Yet, they held. Within the SS, Demyansk became a source of pride, proof that ideology and willpower could overcome impossible odds. Eicke exploited this relentlessly. He wrote reports praising his men's fanaticism, emphasizing how SS toughness exceeded Wehrmacht resilience. The narrative shifted. Totenkopf wasn't just a division, it was a brotherhood forged in shared suffering. The survivors had earned membership in something exclusive and terrible. When they finally left the pocket in May 1942 and were evacuated to France for rebuilding, they carried Demyansk with them, in their missing limbs, their traumatized psyches, and their absolute conviction that they'd already survived the worst war could offer. They were wrong, of course, but the myth was powerful. And myths, in war, can be as important as weapons. January 15th, 1943. Kharkov, Ukraine. The rebuilt Totenkopf division rolls east again, but this time they're riding, not marching. 124 tanks, 144 half-tracks, thousands of trucks form an armored column stretching for kilometers. The young S-men, many of whom never saw the Demyansk hell, peer out at the frozen landscape. They're part of something new, the S Panzer Corps, 3 mechanized S divisions being concentrated for a crucial mission. Kharkov, Ukraine's 4th largest city, has just fallen to a Soviet winter offensive. Stalin's forces are pushing westward, threatening to collapse the entire southern front. And Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, has a desperate plan: counterattack with the SS. Use their fanaticism and fresh equipment to blunt the Soviet advance, recapture Kharkov, and stabilize the front before spring. It's a massive gamble. The SS has never operated as a corps-level formation. These are barely trained tank crews facing battle-hardened Soviet Guards units. But Germany has no choice. The Eastern Front is collapsing. The situation was catastrophic. The German 6th Army had just been destroyed at Stalingrad, 300,000 men dead, captured, or missing. Soviet forces, emboldened by their greatest victory, were advancing all along the southern front. By mid-February, they'd recaptured Kursk, Rostov, and Kharkov. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat. Only Manstein's tactical brilliance and desperate improvisation prevented complete collapse. His plan was audacious. Let the Soviets overextend themselves, then counterattack against their flanks with concentrated armor. The SS Panzer Corps, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions would be the hammer, fresh. From refitting in Western Europe, equipped with the latest tanks and vehicles, they represented Germany's mobile reserve. If they failed, there was nothing behind them. Army Group South would disintegrate, and Germany would lose Ukraine, its primary source of grain and industrial resources. Totenkopf arrived at the front on February 15th and immediately entered combat. The division was assigned to the northern flank, tasked with screening Kharkov, while the main SS counteroffensive developed to the south. Their first engagement was a shock, not because they met heavy resistance, but because Soviet tactics had evolved. The Red Army of early 1943 was not the Red Army of 1941. Soviet commanders had learned from catastrophic defeats. They coordinated armor and infantry better. Their artillery was more concentrated. Their T-34 tanks, superior to German Panzer IIIs and equal to Panzer IVs, were now deployed in proper formations rather than being fed piecemeal into battle. Totenkopf's first tank engagement on February 16th cost them 8 Panzer IIIs and 3 Panzer IVs destroyed. The young tank commanders, with their abbreviated training, were learning hard lessons under fire, but the division also possessed advantages. The mechanization that had taken 6 months to achieve meant Totenkopf could move faster than Soviet units, could concentrate force at decisive points, could withdraw and reposition before being fixed in place. On February 19th, Manstein launched his counteroffensive. The SS Panzer Corps struck northeast toward Kharkov, hitting Soviet flanks that were extended and vulnerable. Totenkopf's role was to prevent Soviet reinforcements from reaching the battle by cutting roads and rail lines. Over 10 days, the division conducted a series of rapid advances and delaying actions. Seize a village, hold it for hours, withdraw before being surrounded, repeat. It was mobile warfare at its purest. Exactly what mechanized forces were designed to do. By early March, the Soviet offensive had been halted. Now came the question, would the SS attempt to retake Kharkov? Hitler demanded it. The city had symbolic importance far beyond its strategic value. Manstein was reluctant. Urban warfare favored defenders, and Soviet forces in Kharkov were substantial. But Hitler insisted, and the SS obeyed. Beginning March 11th, 3 SS divisions assaulted the city. Totenkopf attacked from the north, Leibstandart from the west, Das Reich from the south. The battle was savage. Soviet defenders, mostly NKVD troops and Red Army infantry, fought building by building. The Germans employed combined arms tactics. Tanks blasted strong points, infantry cleared buildings, engineers demolished obstacles. Artillery provided continuous fire support. Totenkopf pushed into the northern districts through streets lined with rubble and bodies. Casualty rates were appalling, 40 to 50% in some companies, but the SS kept attacking. The fighting in Kharkov revealed the dark fusion of military competence and war crimes that defined Totenkopf. By day, they fought professionally, coordinating tank infantry teams, clearing buildings systematically, providing medical care for their wounded. By night, they executed prisoners and massacred civilians. On March 13th, after particularly heavy fighting in the northern suburbs, SS troops rounded up approximately 1,800 Soviet soldiers who'd surrendered or been wounded. They were marched to a railroad yard and shot. The justification was that they were commissars and partisans. No evidence supported this claim. The reality was that Totenkopf, frustrated by casualties and urban warfare, was reverting to concentration camp methods. When stressed, kill those in your power. The massacre at Yefremovka was worse. This village, 20 kilometers northeast of Kharkov, had been used by Soviet forces as a staging area during the battle. After Barum, Soviet troops withdrew. Totenkopf moved in seeking partisan collaborators. What followed on March 18th was methodical extermination. 387 civilians were assembled in the village square. Men were separated and shot immediately. Women and children were locked in a church. The church was set on fire. Those who escaped the flames were shot. Among the dead were 184 children. Soviet investigators who exhumed the mass graves in 1944 documented the massacre in detail. None of the victims were armed. None were in uniform. This was not combat. This was genocide masquerading as anti-partisan operations. By March 23rd, Kharkov was back in German hands. The Third Battle of Kharkov was hailed as a brilliant German victory. And militarily, it was. Manstein had stabilized the southern front, destroyed multiple Soviet armies, and demonstrated that Germany could still execute successful offensive operations. The SS Panzer Corps had performed well. Totenkopf claimed 418 Soviet tanks destroyed during the operation, though this number, like most German kill claims, was probably inflated. Still, the division had proven its worth as a mechanized formation. The abbreviated training hadn't prevented them from fighting effectively. The young tank commanders had learned on the job. The mechanization had worked. From a purely military perspective, the rebuilt Totenkopf was a success, but the human cost was staggering on all sides. Soviet forces lost an estimated 60,000 killed and captured at Kharkov. German casualties were lower, but still substantial. Totenkopf suffered 4,500 casualties in 6 weeks of fighting, 1/4 of its strength. and the atrocities continued uncounted in official records. Soviet civilians in the Kharkov region, how many died? 20,000? 30,000? The exact number is unknowable because Totenkopf kept no records of anti-civilian operations, and Soviet death tolls were compiled piecemeal from survivor testimonies and mass graves discovered after the war. What's certain is that everywhere Totenkopf operated, civilian deaths spiked. The pattern was consistent: military success accompanied by genocide. Manstein himself was aware of SS atrocities. Wehrmacht officers filed reports documenting prisoner executions and civilian massacres. Manstein read them, made disapproving notations, and did nothing. His position was that he needed the SS divisions for combat, that their effectiveness outweighed their criminality, that controlling them was impossible anyway since they answered to Himmler, not the Wehrmacht. It was moral cowardice dressed as military pragmatism, and it established a template that would persist through the war. The Wehrmacht would collaborate with SS genocide because the SS were militarily useful. The Death's Head divisions were too valuable to discipline, too fanatical to control, too criminal to acknowledge. So, they were used, and tens of thousands died who should have lived. By April 1943, Totenkopf withdrew from Kharkov for rest and refitting. They had been blooded in mechanized warfare and performed well. The division had proven it could coordinate combined arms, could execute mobile operations, could fight effectively in both open terrain and cities. The tank crews, despite inadequate training, had learned their craft in battle. The young soldiers had experienced the intensity of the Eastern Front and not broken. From the SS perspective, the rebuilt Totenkopf was everything Himmler wanted: militarily competent and ideologically reliable. They would fight hard and kill without hesitation. That they were also war criminals was not a concern. That was, in fact, part of the design. As the division prepared for its next operation, a massive offensive called Operation Citadel, the question was not whether they would commit more atrocities. The question was only how many, and whether anyone would ever be held accountable. The answer to the second question, in spring 1943, seemed to be no. The beast had been reborn in steel, and it was hungry. September 23, 1943, Dnieper River, Ukraine. Totenkopf engineers are planting demolition charges on a railway bridge while Soviet artillery pounds the far bank. The division is retreating, not panicking, not collapsing, but conducting a fighting withdrawal, the most difficult operation in warfare. Behind them, the Wehrmacht's entire southern front is pulling back from the Dnieper to avoid encirclement. Ahead, Soviet forces are racing to reach the river first, to turn an organized retreat into a rout. And Totenkopf has been assigned the most dangerous role, rear guard. They're the last German unit between the pursuing Red Army and disaster. Their job is to delay Soviet advances, destroy infrastructure, hold river crossings until other units escape, then withdraw across, themselves. It's a mission that accepts casualties as inevitable, but Totenkopf, scarred by Demyansk and hardened by Kharkov, has discovered a terrible talent. They're brilliant at defensive warfare. They know how to make the enemy pay for every kilometer. They know how to die slowly while making others die faster. The retreat from the Dnieper was the consequence of Kursk. Operation Citadel, the massive German offensive in July 1943, had failed catastrophically. Germany had committed its best divisions, including Totenkopf, to a double envelopment around the Kursk salient. The battle became the largest tank engagement in history. For 2 weeks, thousands of tanks clashed in clouds of dust and smoke. German forces penetrated deep into Soviet defenses, but couldn't achieve breakthrough. Soviet reserves kept appearing, fresh divisions replacing shattered ones, faster than the Germans could destroy them. By mid-July, Hitler canceled the offensive. Germany had lost the strategic initiative forever. Now Soviet forces were counterattacking all along the front. Army Group South, which included Totenkopf, faced potential encirclement if it didn't withdraw immediately. The order came on August 4th. Fall back to the Dnieper River, over 300 kilometers to the west. Rearguard operations require discipline. Most units don't possess. You must fight hard enough to delay the enemy, but not so hard you can't withdraw. You must inflict casualties but not take unsustainable losses yourself. You must destroy infrastructure, bridges, railways, roads, so the enemy can't advance quickly, but you must preserve enough infrastructure to facilitate your own withdrawal. It's a balancing act that demands tactical competence, emotional control, and excellent unit cohesion. Totenkopf, despite their youth and brutality, excelled at it. The division would establish defensive positions, force Soviet forces to deploy from march column into assault formation, fight for hours or days, then withdraw before being encircled. They became masters of the delaying action. Hold a village until flanked, retreat 5 kilometers, hold the next village, repeat. The cost was measured in German and Soviet blood. From August through December 1943, Totenkopf suffered 6,800 casualties, nearly 40% of the division's strength, but Soviet forces paid a far higher price. The division claimed 89 Soviet tanks destroyed in November alone during fighting around the Dnieper bridgeheads. Infantry casualties inflicted on pursuing Soviet forces were estimated at 38,000. The exchange ratio, casualties inflicted versus casualties suffered, was among the best in the Wehrmacht. Totenkopf was learning that defensive warfare, properly executed, favored the defender enormously. A tank in a prepared position could destroy multiple attacking tanks. Infantry in fortified buildings could hold off larger forces. Artillery, firing from pre-registered positions, could devastate Soviet assault formations. The Red Army's numerical superiority mattered less when they had to attack across open ground into prepared defenses. But the retreat also revealed Totenkopf's capacity for systematic destruction. As Soviet forces advanced, Germany implemented scorched earth policy across Ukraine. Hitler's orders were explicit: leave nothing the enemy can use. Wehrmacht units interpreted this narrowly: destroy military infrastructure, maybe burn grain silos. Totenkopf interpreted it broadly. Between August and December 1943, the division burned 47 villages, destroyed over 400 kilometers of railroad track, demolished every bridge in their zone of operations, and forcibly evacuated or killed approximately 5,200 civilians. The rationale was to deny resources to the Soviets. The reality was genocide continuing under new justification. Ukrainian peasants were not military threats, but they were Slavs in territory Germany wanted for Lebensraum, so they were expendable. The defense of Kremenchug bridgehead in late September illustrated both tactical skill and moral depravity. Soviet forces, having crossed the Dnieper north and south of the city, were trying to collapse the German pocket. Totenkopf held the western bank, defending the last bridge, allowing German forces to escape. The tactical situation was desperate, outnumbered 8-1, running low on ammunition, flanked on both sides. Yet the division held for 3 weeks. They used every defensive tactic imaginable: pre-planned artillery barrages, counterattacks by small tank groups, infiltration of Soviet positions at night to sow confusion, constant repositioning to avoid being fixed. Soviet assaults were methodically destroyed. Wave after wave of Red Army infantry attacked and died. By the time Totenkopf finally withdrew on October 6th, Soviet forces had suffered catastrophic casualties, taking a position they should have overrun in days. But while holding Kremenchug militarily, Totenkopf was conducting massacres behind the lines. The division's medical reports from September and October note a disturbing psychological phenomenon: increasing detachment from moral consequences. Doctors observed that many soldiers showed abnormal aggression, reduced empathy, and inability to distinguish combatants from civilians. In clinical terms, they were describing trained sociopathy. What the doctors didn't mention was that this condition was encouraged by command. Eicke and his officers wanted men capable of fighting all day and killing civilians at night. The concentration camp methodology, dehumanization of designated enemies, was functioning exactly as designed. Soldiers who could burn a village full of women and children in the evening could defend a bridge against impossible odds the next morning. The two actions, in SS ideology, were part of the same mission. December 1943 brought an incident that shocked even hardened SS officers. During a Soviet breakthrough near Kiev, elements of Totenkopf's 1st Panzergrenadier Regiment were temporarily encircled. When relief forces broke through the next day, they found 12 SS soldiers shot dead, executed by their own officers for being too wounded to evacuate. The company commander's report matter-of-factly explained that the men couldn't walk, vehicles were full, and falling into Soviet hands would compromise intelligence security, so they were shot in the head and left behind. This was not official policy, but neither was it unusual. SS doctrine increasingly accepted that soldiers were expendable ammunition. The division had learned from Demyansk that being captured by Soviets usually meant death. Better, in SS logic, to kill your own wounded than let them be captured. It was a calculus of horror that Wehrmacht units generally rejected, but SS formations accepted. The Siud. Psychological toll was immense but invisible. SS medical reports focused on physical casualties, the killed, the wounded, the frostbitten. They ignored or minimized psychological casualties. Yet the evidence is clear in personal letters and post-war testimonies. Soldiers were breaking. They experienced nightmares, emotional numbness, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, violence against comrades. One SS officer's diary, recovered after the war, describes watching young soldiers cry uncontrollably after battles, unable to articulate why. Another describes widespread use of Pervitin, methamphetamine issued to troops as performance enhancement, creating addiction and psychosis. The division was being sustained chemically and ideologically, but human psychology has limits. Men were reaching theirs, yet Totenkopf didn't collapse. Other German divisions mutinied, disintegrated, or fled during the 1943 retreats. Totenkopf maintained cohesion through the worst conditions. Why? Part was technical. They were well-equipped, relatively well-supplied, and led by experienced officers who understood defensive tactics. Part was psychological. Demyansk survivors had already endured the worst imaginable conditions. So, the 1943 retreat, though brutal, seemed manageable by comparison. But the largest factor was ideological. These men genuinely believed in the Nazi cause, believed they were fighting for Germany's survival, believed retreat was temporary before inevitable victory. The ideology that made them capable of genocide also made them capable of extraordinary military sacrifice. By January 1944, Totenkopf had retreated approximately 1,000 kilometers from their high water mark at Kursk. They had reached defensive positions in western Ukraine near the pre-war Polish border. The division had conducted one of the most successful fighting withdrawals of the war, maintaining unit integrity despite overwhelming Soviet pressure. They'd proven defensive mastery, but they'd also left behind a trail of destruction and murder. The retreating Death's Head had burned everything, killed thousands, and demonstrated that Totenkopf was most dangerous not when advancing, but when cornered. The beast had learned to die slowly, making everyone else die faster, and the war was only going to get worse. April 3, 1944. Somewhere in western Ukraine, 5 Tiger tanks sit motionless in a tree line, engines silent, camouflaged with branches and canvas. These mechanical monsters, each weighing 57 tons and armed with the legendary 88mm gun, have just arrived at Totenkopf. Only 5 tanks, but they're worth 50 lesser machines. Inside the commander's Tiger, SS Oberscharführer Otto Karius studies the terrain ahead through binoculars. Soviet T-34 tanks are approaching. He counts 23 of them. The Soviets don't know the Tigers are here. In 15 minutes, this will become a textbook ambush. Karius will personally destroy 8 Soviet tanks in 6 minutes. His wingman will claim 6 more. The engagement will last 12 minutes total before the surviving Soviet tanks flee, leaving 17 smoking wrecks behind. Not a single Tiger will be scratched. This is what happens when superior technology meets superior training. And Totenkopf is becoming experts at converting German industrial quality into Soviet death. By 1944, Totenkopf had evolved from concentration camp guards to professional armored warriors. The transformation was not moral. They remained war criminals, but technical. The division now understood mechanized warfare at a sophisticated level. They had learned through 2 years of continuous combat how to coordinate tanks with infantry, how to position artillery for maximum effect, how to use terrain, how to exploit enemy mistakes, how to preserve their own strength while destroying the enemy's. The abbreviated training of 1942 had been supplemented by the brutal education of actual warfare. Survivors had become experts. And the SS system, for all its ideological insanity, was good at analyzing combat performance and disseminating lessons learned. The arrival of Tiger tanks in April 1944 was transformative. Germany produced Tigers in limited numbers, only 1,300 during the entire war, so receiving even 5 was significant. The Tiger I was a qualitative masterpiece. Massively armored, mounting the 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. Mechanically complex but devastatingly effective when properly employed. The problem was mechanical unreliability and fuel consumption. A Tiger needed careful maintenance, skilled crews, and constant fuel supplies. But when those conditions were met, Tigers were battlefield dominators. Totenkopf's 5 Tigers immediately became the division's core around which tactics revolved. Otto Karius represented the new Totenkopf, technically brilliant and morally empty. Born in 1922, he'd joined the Wehrmacht in 1940, transferred to the SS in 1943, and quickly demonstrated exceptional talent for tank warfare. By 1944, at age 21, he was a Tiger commander with a growing reputation. His tactics were textbook: find good positions, wait for the enemy to approach, engage at maximum range where German optics and guns had overwhelming advantage, destroy lead and rear vehicles to trap the column, methodically destroy everything in between, withdraw before enemy artillery could respond. It was murder disguised as combat, but murder executed with such precision that even Soviet commanders respected it. Karius would survive the war credited with destroying over 150 enemy tanks. His memoirs, published in the 1950s, became international bestsellers, a war criminal celebrated for technical competence. The division's tactical doctrine crystallized around what Germans called the Panzerkeil, the armored wedge. Tigers led at the point, providing long-range firepower and breakthrough capability. Panzer IV medium tanks protected the flanks, engaging at medium ranges. Panzer Grenadiers followed in half-tracks, ready to dismount and clear infantry resistance. Artillery provided rolling barrages ahead of the advance or defensive fires if attacking. Reconnaissance elements screened the flanks and identified enemy positions. Engineers cleared obstacles. It was combined arms warfare perfected through hard experience. When executed properly, the Panzerkeil could break through Soviet defenses that outnumbered it 5-1. The Red Army had more tanks, more men, more artillery. But Totenkopf, when properly supplied and positioned, could achieve local superiority through superior coordination. February 1944 brought the ultimate test. The Korsun-Cherkasy Pocket. Soviet forces encircled 60,000 German troops in central Ukraine. Hitler, repeating his Stalingrad mistake, forbade withdrawal. Totenkopf was outside the pocket, tasked with breaking through Soviet lines to establish an escape corridor. The fighting was apocalyptic. Totenkopf launched repeated attacks against Soviet defenses, suffering 2,000 casualties in 10 days but failing to break through. Finally, on February 16th, German forces inside the pocket attempted breakout. In a blizzard, 55,000 men charged toward Totenkopf's positions. The breakout turned into slaughter as Soviet forces ambushed the fleeing Germans. Totenkopf's role was to keep the corridor open as long as possible. They fired continuously for 8 hours, covering the retreat. Approximately 32,000 Germans reached safety. The rest died or were captured. Totenkopf had performed brilliantly but couldn't change strategic reality. Germany was losing the war through arithmetic. The division's willingness to accept catastrophic casualties remained shocking. Wehrmacht doctrine suggested withdrawing when casualties exceeded 15% in a single engagement. Totenkopf considered 30% acceptable, even expected. This was partly ideological. Death for the Führer was glorious, but partly practical. The division had learned that in the East, you either destroyed the enemy or were destroyed yourself. Half measures failed, so they fought with suicidal intensity, taking losses that should have broken unit cohesion but didn't. The SS cult of death, macabre as it was, created soldiers willing to die in ways that Wehrmacht troops increasingly refused. By 1944, Wehrmacht units were surrendering regularly. Totenkopf almost never did. They fought until annihilated or until ordered to retreat. It made them militarily valuable but strategically irrelevant. Winning tactical battles couldn't change Germany's strategic collapse. The anti-partisan operations continued throughout 1944, though by now the euphemism had worn thin. There were real Soviet partisans operating behind German lines, resistance fighters blowing up trains, ambushing convoys, gathering intelligence. but Totenkopf's response was indiscriminate massacre. In May 1944, after a supply convoy was ambushed near Kovel, the division conducted 3 days of reprisals. 2,100 civilians were killed across 14 villages. Of those, only 73 were armed or had any connection to partisan activity. The rest were farmers, women, children, elderly people. Soviet investigators after the war documented the massacres through survivor testimony and forensic evidence. The pattern was consistent with earlier atrocities: collective punishment, racial targeting, methodical execution. What made these operations particularly disturbing was their banality. The same soldiers who executed sophisticated tank ambushes would spend the next day burning villages. There was no apparent psychological distinction. Orders came down from division headquarters: conduct anti-partisan sweep in Sector X. Units would deploy, surround villages, separate men from women, execute males above fighting age, burn structures, move to next village. It was routine. After-action reports described these operations with the same clinical detachment used for tank battles. Pacification operations Sector 14B resulted in 207 enemy casualties, 16 weapons captured, 4 villages destroyed. The dead enemies included babies, but that fact didn't appear in reports. The division had so thoroughly dehumanized local populations that killing them wasn't murder, it was operational housekeeping. By summer 1944, Totenkopf's situation was deteriorating. The division was still formidable. Equipment, training, and experience made them one of Germany's best formations, but they were being ground down by attrition, replacement. Soldiers arrived constantly, but they were increasingly young, poorly trained, and unable to match the veterans they replaced. The original Totenkopf, the men who'd crossed into the Soviet Union in June 1941, were mostly dead. The Demyansk survivors were mostly dead. Even the France-rebuilt veterans from 1942 were mostly dead. The division was now on its 4th or 5th generation of personnel, each generation slightly less capable than the last. The institutional memory remained. Veterans trained newcomers in Totenkopf methods, but the overall quality declined. And Soviet forces were improving: better tactics, better equipment, better coordination. The gap was narrowing. The division received a brief respite in July 1944 when they were pulled from the front for refitting. They'd lost 60% of their vehicles, suffered 8,000 casualties since January, and desperately needed reconstitution. The division was withdrawn to Poland, where new tanks, trucks, and personnel arrived, but the replacements were increasingly substandard: 16-year-olds with minimal training. Kriegsmarine sailors retrained as infantry after Germany's surface fleet was destroyed. Luftwaffe ground crew converted to combat troops after Germany lost air superiority. These men wore Totenkopf insignia, but they weren't the fanatical SS warriors of earlier years. They were German teenagers and sailors thrown into desperate situations they couldn't control. The killing machine was being maintained, but its parts were wearing out, and the war was accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion. July 5, 1943, 04:30 hours. Kursk salient, southern sector. German artillery begins the largest preparatory bombardment in history. Over 3,000 guns fire simultaneously, targeting Soviet positions dug into the rolling steppe. The noise is beyond human comprehension, a continuous roar that makes the earth shake, that turns dawn into artificial night with smoke and dust. And waiting behind the guns, engines running, crews tense, is the greatest concentration of German armor ever assembled. Totenkopf sits in the second wave, part of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, 3 elite divisions with over 600 tanks, nearly 100 Tiger and Panther heavy tanks, thousands of veteran soldiers. Their mission is simple and impossible: break through the Soviet defensive lines, encircle the Kursk salient, destroy 5 Soviet armies, and prove Germany can still win the war in the East. For the next 12 days, Totenkopf will fight harder than they've ever fought. They'll advance further than any other German unit. They'll claim over 200 Soviet tanks destroyed, and they'll lose anyway, because sometimes tactical brilliance cannot overcome strategic bankruptcy. Operation Citadel was Hitler's last gasp at offensive warfare. After the disasters of Stalingrad and the Kharkov retreat, Germany needed a victory. The Kursk salient, a 500-kilometer Soviet bulge into German lines, presented an obvious target: pinch it off from north and south, trap the Soviet forces inside, restore the Eastern Front to a shorter, more defensible line. Simple in concept, catastrophically difficult in execution. The problem was that the Soviets knew it was coming. Stalin's intelligence services had informed him of German preparations months in advance. The Red Army had constructed the most elaborate defensive system in history, 3 defensive belts totaling 50 kilometers deep, 6,000 anti-tank guns, 1.3 million troops, over 3,000 tanks, layered minefields, prepared artillery positions. The Germans would be attacking into prepared defenses with full Soviet knowledge of where and when the attack would come. The first day exposed the magnitude of the challenge. Totenkopf advanced at 0500 hours, following Wehrmacht panzer units that hit the Hr, Soviet First Defensive Line. Progress was measured in meters. Soviet anti-tank guns, carefully concealed, destroyed German tanks at point-blank range. Minefields channeled advancing armor into kill zones where pre-registered Soviet artillery waited. Counterattacks by Soviet armor hit German flanks. By nightfall, Totenkopf had advanced 8 kilometers and lost 23 tanks. 8 kilometers. At that rate, reaching the operational depth required for encirclement would take weeks, and Germany didn't have weeks. This was supposed to be a lightning operation, breakthrough and exploitation within days. Instead, it was becoming grinding attrition, exactly the warfare Germany couldn't win. Days 2 through 6 saw incremental progress at catastrophic cost. Totenkopf, now leading the 2nd SS Panzer Corps advance, pushed through the 2nd Soviet defensive line. The fighting was intimate and savage. Villages changed hands multiple times. Soviet infantry, dug into deep bunkers, had to be cleared with grenades and flamethrowers. Soviet anti-tank guns were positioned so cleverly that German tanks would be fired upon from 3 directions simultaneously. Totenkopf's tactical solution was the Panzerkeil formation, Tigers at the front soaking up punishment while destroying anti-tank positions, Panzer IVs exploiting gaps, Panzer Grenadiers clearing infantry resistance. It worked. The division penetrated 35 kilometers into Soviet defenses, deeper than any other German unit. But the cost was staggering. 68 tanks damaged or destroyed, 1,700 casualties in 6 days. July 12, 1943, Prokhorovka. This name would become legendary, the largest tank battle in history. Soviet intelligence indicated the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was approaching the 3rd Soviet defensive line near this village. If the Germans broke through here, they'd reach open terrain where their superior tactics and equipment would dominate. Stalin ordered the 5th Guards Tank Army to stop them. Approximately 800 tanks would meet in a battle that defied imagination. Soviet planners, knowing German tanks had superior range and optics, ordered their T-34 tanks to close rapidly and fight at point-blank range where German advantages disappeared. It was brave to the point of suicidal, and it worked. The battle opened with Soviet tanks streaming toward German positions at full speed. Totenkopf's Tigers and Panthers engaged at 2,000 meters, destroying lead Soviet tanks. But the T-34s kept coming, accepting catastrophic losses to close the distance. Within minutes, the battlefield became chaos. Tanks were fighting at ranges of 50 meters or less. Soviet tankers rammed German vehicles when ammunition ran out. The air filled with diesel smoke, burning tanks, exploding ammunition. Totenkopf's tactical sophistication meant nothing in this mechanical brawl. A Tiger's superior armor doesn't matter when a T-34 shoots it from 10 meters away. The fighting continued for 2 days. When it ended, the battlefield was littered with over 700 destroyed tanks from both sides. Prokhorovka wasn't a battle, it was mutual annihilation. Totenkopf's performance at Prokhorovka was simultaneously impressive and futile. The division claimed destroying 209 Soviet tanks during Operation Citadel. German kill claims were habitually inflated, but even if we accept half that figure, it represents extraordinary lethality. The division's tank crews, including Otto Carius and other aces, were operating at peak effectiveness. Their tactics worked. Their equipment, when not outnumbered 10-1, dominated, but none of it mattered strategically. Germany could destroy 500 Soviet tanks, and the Soviets would build 500 more. Germany could kill 50,000 Soviet soldiers, and fresh divisions would appear. The Soviet Union had population, industrial capacity, and strategic depth that Germany couldn't match. Prokhorovka proved that tactical excellence couldn't compensate for strategic weakness. Hitler canceled Operation Citadel on July 17th. The official reason was that Anglo-American forces had landed in Sicily and Germany needed reserves in the Mediterranean. The real reason was that Citadel had failed. After 12 days, German forces had penetrated perhaps 40 kilometers into a defensive system 50 kilometers deep. They hadn't achieved breakthrough. They hadn't encircled Soviet forces. They had lost approximately 54,000 casualties and 800 tanks in exchange for inflicting perhaps twice that on the Soviets, a ratio Germany could no longer sustain. The Wehrmacht would never again launch a major offensive in the east. Every battle from Kursk forward would be defensive, delaying inevitable defeat. For Totenkopf, Kursk represented peak performance in a losing cause. The division had fought as well as any formation in military history. Their training, equipment, and tactics were exemplary. Individual soldiers had shown extraordinary courage. Tank commanders had demonstrated skill that Soviet counterparts couldn't match. But they'd been thrown against an enemy who could absorb any level of casualties and keep fighting. The mathematics were brutal. Germany had fielded roughly 600 tanks in the 2nd SS Panzer Corps at Kursk's start. Totenkopf alone claimed destroying 209 Soviet tanks. The entire corps claimed over 1,000 Soviet tank kills. Yet when the battle ended, Soviet tank forces were intact and continuing counteroffensives. German tank forces were depleted and retreating. You can't win through kill ratios when the enemy treats soldiers as ammunition. The aftermath was psychologically devastating. Totenkopf's soldiers, who had been promised this offensive would change the war, watched the retreat begin. The division had pushed 35 kilometers into Soviet lines, further than anyone else, and gained nothing. Kursk broke something in German morale that no propaganda could repair. Until July 1943, soldiers could believe in eventual victory, that one more offensive might crack Soviet resistance. After Kursk, that delusion ended. Everyone knew Germany was losing. The only questions were how long and how badly. Totenkopf would spend the next 22 months in continuous retreat, fighting brilliantly and losing inevitably, watching the Red Army roll westward toward Berlin. Kursk was the high water mark. Everything that followed was decline. The beast had shown its maximum capability and learned it wasn't enough. Now came the long dying. October 22nd, 1943. Somewhere in eastern Ukraine. Totenkopf's rear guard holds a village whose name appears on no German maps. They've held it for 6 hours. Soviet artillery has reduced most buildings to rubble. Soviet infantry has attacked 4 times. The SS men are exhausted, running low on ammunition, and awaiting orders to withdraw. Those orders will come in 2 hours. Then they'll retreat 10 kilometers west, establish new positions, and do this all over again tomorrow. This is what retreat looks like when you're not collapsing. Constant small battles, continuous withdrawal, grinding attrition. Since August, the division has retreated 400 kilometers. They'll retreat another 1,000 before it stops. Behind them, they're leaving burned bridges, demolished railways, scorched villages. Ahead lies Poland, then Germany, then nothing. The war has changed. Totenkopf is no longer advancing toward Moscow. They're retreating toward Berlin. And every kilometer westward brings them closer to final defeat. The strategic situation by fall 1943 was irreversible. Soviet forces, having won at Kursk, launched offensives all along the front. Army Group South, which included Totenkopf, faced encirclement if they didn't withdraw immediately. But Hitler's refusal to authorize timely retreats meant every withdrawal became a near disaster. Units would hold too long, get partially encircled, fight their way out with heavy casualties, retreat to the next defensive line, repeat. It was a formula for maximum attrition. Smart generals like Manstein begged Hitler to conduct elastic defense, withdraw to strong positions, let Soviets overextend, counterattack their flanks. Hitler refused. Every retreat was authorized only at the last moment, turning strategic withdrawals into tactical emergencies. Totenkopf, ironically, benefited from its outsider status. Because the SS answered to Himmler, not Wehrmacht command, SS divisions sometimes received withdrawal authorization earlier than army units. Eicke, who had cultivated direct access to Himmler and Hitler, could sometimes bypass rigid command structures. This saved the division from encirclement multiple times. When Wehrmacht units were trapped because of delayed withdrawal orders, Totenkopf would already be pulling back to prepared positions. It was unfair, it contradicted military hierarchy, and it kept the division functional while Wehrmacht formations disintegrated. The SS's political privileges, so resented earlier, became tactical advantages during retreat. The retreat from the Dnieper to western Ukraine, August 1943 through January 1944, covered approximately 800 kilometers. Totenkopf served as rearguard for much of this distance, fighting continuous delaying actions. The division's casualty rate during these 6 months was actually lower than during offensive operations, 6,800 casualties versus the 9,200 suffered at Kursk. Why? Because defensive warfare, when properly executed, favors the defender. German forces could establish positions, force Soviets to attack across open ground, inflict heavy casualties, withdraw before being outflanked. The Soviets, pursuing rapidly, couldn't always coordinate their assaults effectively. Their supply lines were stretching. They were capturing territory faster than they could consolidate it. So, paradoxically, retreating Germany was sometimes more effective than advancing Germany had been. But the cost to Soviet civilians and infrastructure was apocalyptic. Hitler's scorched earth directives were clear: leave nothing the enemy can use. Wehrmacht units implemented this narrowly, destroying military targets. Totenkopf implemented it as genocide. Between August 1943 and January 1944, in their zone of operations, the division burned 180 villages, destroyed 400 kilometers of railroad, demolished all bridges, forcibly evacuated 18,000 civilians, and executed unknown thousands more. Soviet investigators cataloged these destructions after the war, finding mass graves and burned settlements across Totenkopf's line of retreat. The justification was military necessity: deny resources to the enemy. The reality was continuation of genocidal policies under new names. The destruction was sometimes pointless, even by military logic. Burning peasant villages didn't significantly impact Soviet logistics. The Red Army was supplied by American Lend-Lease trucks and their own rail system. Executing villagers didn't prevent partisan activity, it encouraged it. Demolishing bridges did delay Soviet pursuit, but only briefly. Soviet engineers could rebuild bridges in days. Yet the destruction continued because it was ideologically satisfying. SS doctrine held that Slavic populations in the East would be eliminated or enslaved eventually, so killing them during retreat was simply starting that process early. The long retreat became mobile genocide, killing as you go, leaving nothing but corpses and ashes. April 1944 brought Totenkopf's most challenging moment: breakout from the Kamenets-Podolsky Pocket. Soviet forces had encircled 55,000 German troops, including the division, in western Ukraine. Hitler initially refused withdrawal permission, setting up another Stalingrad. But the trapped forces, remembering Stalingrad's outcome, lobbied desperately for breakout authorization. Finally, in mid-April, Hitler relented. Totenkopf was assigned to lead the breakout. Their combat experience and remaining armor made them the most capable formation in the pocket. On April 7th, the breakout began. Soviet forces, anticipating the attempt, had prepared defensive positions. The fighting was apocalyptic. The breakout was a running battle across 50 kilometers of Soviet-controlled territory. Totenkopf's remaining tanks, fewer than 40 operational, led the advance, smashing through Soviet blocking positions. Panzer Grenadiers followed, fighting off Soviet counterattacks. The column was under continuous artillery fire. Soviet aircraft strafed the roads. By the second day, fuel was running out. Wounded were being left behind, killed by their own officers or abandoned to Soviet capture. Totenkopf lost 3,000 men during the breakout, but the division made it to German lines intact. Most of the pocket's other units disintegrated. Approximately 22,000 Germans died, were captured, or went missing, but 33,000 escaped, largely because Totenkopf forced the corridor open and kept it open long enough for others to escape. The breakout burnished Totenkopf's reputation within the Wehrmacht. Even officers who despised the SS acknowledged that Totenkopf had saved thousands of lives at Kamenets-Podolsky. The division's willingness to accept catastrophic casualties to achieve mission objectives Their tactical competence under desperate conditions, their refusal to surrender, these made them militarily invaluable. But this same reputation obscured their ongoing criminality. During the breakout, SS troops executed approximately 700 Ukrainian civilians accused of aiding Soviet forces. After reaching German lines, they conducted anti-partisan operations that killed 1,200 more civilians. The military heroism and the genocide were inseparable. You couldn't have one without the other. Totenkopf was an effective military formation because they were ideological fanatics willing to commit any atrocity. By October 1944, the division had retreated to the Carpathian Mountains on the Hungarian border. They'd traveled 1,500 kilometers west since Kursk, fighting almost continuously for 14 months. Personnel turnover had been catastrophic. 70% of the soldiers in October 1944 had joined the division after Kursk. The original members, those concentration camp guards who'd invaded France in May 1940, were almost all dead. Even the France-rebuilt veterans from 1942 were mostly gone. Totenkopf was now on its fourth or fifth iteration, continuously recycled with new bodies, losing institutional memory with each generation but maintaining ideological character. They were still the Death's Head division, still capable of brilliance and atrocity, but increasingly exhausted. The retreat had one unintended consequence. It brought Totenkopf closer to the genocide infrastructure. As German forces withdrew from Ukraine and Belarus, they retreated through Poland, past concentration camps and killing sites. Soldiers who had never known about the Holocaust's industrial scale saw the camps. They smelled Auschwitz-Birkenau. They passed trainloads of prisoners being evacuated westward. For many Totenkopf soldiers, this was disturbing, not morally, but practically. They'd been killing Jews and Slavs individually or in small groups for years. But seeing the industrial machinery of genocide, the factories of death, was shocking even to hardened SS men. Some expressed doubt in letters home that were intercepted by censors. The doubt wasn't moral. They didn't question whether Jews should be killed. They questioned whether Germany could win a war while simultaneously exterminating millions. It was pragmatic doubt, not ethical doubt. But even that represented a crack in ideological certainty. The retreat was corroding everything, even Nazi faith. And the worst was yet to come. December 26, 1944, Budapest, Hungary. Soviet forces complete the encirclement. 45,000 German and Hungarian troops are trapped inside Hungary's capital city. Among them, the 3rd SS Division Totenkopf, approximately 7,800 men with 31 operational tanks. They have been fighting in Budapest for weeks, house by house, street by street, trying to hold the city as Soviet pincers closed around it. Now the trap is shut. No supply convoys are getting through. No reinforcements are arriving. The Luftwaffe, battered by years of losses, can barely conduct supply flights. Hitler has declared Budapest a fortress that must be held to the last man. The soldiers trapped inside know what that means. It means Stalingrad. Another pocket, another futile stand, another catastrophic loss. But orders are orders. The SS doesn't surrender, so Totenkopf will fight in Budapest until they're dead, captured, or can somehow escape. For the next 50 days, the division will participate in one of the war's most savage urban battles. The city will be destroyed. Tens of thousands will die, and in the end, it will all be meaningless. Because Budapest, like everything else by 1944, is just another delay on the road to defeat. The battle for Budapest had begun in October 1944 when Soviet forces invaded Hungary. Hitler viewed Hungary as critical. It provided Germany's last significant oil supply, a buffer against Soviet advance toward Austria, and political prestige. Losing Hungary meant losing the war. So, German forces, including Totenkopf, were rushed to defend Budapest. The division fought exceptionally well during the initial Soviet assaults, conducting mobile defense that delayed the Soviet advance for weeks. But by December, the situation was hopeless. Soviet forces outnumbered Germans 5-1. Soviet tank production had reached levels Germany couldn't match. And Germany's allies were collapsing. Romania had switched sides. Slovakia was in revolt. Hungary's government was negotiating armistice. On Christmas Eve, Soviet forces completed the encirclement. 45,000 Axis troops were trapped. The siege began. Urban warfare is the most difficult form of combat. Every building is a fortress. Every street is a kill zone. Tanks are vulnerable to infantry, with Panzerfausts hiding in rubble. Artillery causes massive civilian casualties. Supply becomes nearly impossible, and defender advantage disappears when the enemy surrounds you completely. Totenkopf, which had excelled at mobile defense, now faced static siege warfare, the worst possible situation for a mechanized formation. Their tanks, low on fuel, were used as stationary pillboxes. Their mobility, their primary advantage, was negated. They were reduced to defending positions until overwhelmed, then retreating to the next defensive line deeper in the city. The civilian cost was catastrophic. Budapest's population in December 1944 was approximately 800,000. Most couldn't evacuate before encirclement. They were trapped between German defenders and Soviet attackers. Soviet artillery bombarded the city indiscriminately. German forces demolished buildings to create defensive positions. Cellars became shelters where civilians huddled during bombardments. Food ran out within weeks. Water supplies were cut. Disease spread. Malnutrition became universal. By mid-January, thousands of civilians were dying daily from starvation, disease, artillery fire, or bullets. Neither side cared. The Soviets wanted the city captured. The Germans were ordered to hold it. Civilians were simply obstacles in a mechanized abattoir. Totenkopf defended the Pest district, east of the Danube River, through January 1945. The fighting was intimate and murderous. Soviet forces assaulted German positions with infantry supported by tanks. German defenders fired from buildings, ambushed Soviet columns, counterattacked to retake lost positions. Each building changed hands multiple times. Neither side took prisoners. Soviet and German soldiers killed captured enemies routinely. The division's casualty rate was unsustainable, roughly 100 men killed or wounded daily. By mid-January, Totenkopf had lost 40% of its trapped strength. Replacement was impossible. The wounded couldn't be evacuated. Medical supplies were exhausted. The division was being bled to death defending rubble. January 17, 1945. Pest falls. Soviet forces overwhelmed German defenses on the eastern bank. Survivors, including Totenkopf remnants, retreat across the Danube bridges into Buda, the western district. The bridges are then destroyed to slow Soviet pursuit. Now approximately 30,000 German and Hungarian troops are compressed into Buda's hills, awaiting annihilation. Totenkopf numbers perhaps 5,800 survivors. The rest are dead, wounded, or captured. They're out of tanks, low on ammunition, surviving on starvation rations. But Hitler's orders remain: hold to the last man. SS ideology dictates absolute obedience. So, they fortify Buda's buildings and prepare to die fighting rather than surrender. The Buda siege, late January through early February, represented war stripped to its essentials: kill or be killed. Soviet forces, having captured Pest, now concentrated on destroying Buda's defenders. They employed massive artillery barrages, thousands of shells daily, reducing buildings to rubble. They used Katyusha rockets, devastating against concentrated infantry. They sent wave assaults of infantry, accepting horrific casualties to overwhelm German positions. Totenkopf and other trapped units fought with desperation. They had nowhere to retreat. Surrender meant Soviet captivity, which meant death. So, they fought from the rubble, expending their last ammunition, eating their last rations, dying in buildings that had been homes and were now tombs. By early February, the end was obvious. Hungarian units began surrendering en masse. German morale was collapsing. Even SS soldiers were expressing the previously unthinkable: maybe surrender was preferable to death. But Hitler, from his bunker in Berlin, continued sending radio messages demanding Budapest hold forever. He promised relief columns that everyone knew weren't coming. He threatened consequences for surrender. It was lunacy transmitted across hundreds of kilometers to men fighting for their lives. And then, on February 11th, the impossible happened. Officers in the pocket, recognizing that holding was suicide, organized an unauthorized breakout. They would attempt to escape Budapest, reach German lines to the northwest, and save whoever could be saved. It violated direct orders from Hitler, but continuing to obey meant certain death. So, approximately 70,000 Germans and Hungarians would attempt the breakout. February 11th through 13th, 1945. The Budapest breakout was chaos incarnate. 70,000 men, organized into multiple columns, attempted to punch through Soviet encirclement at night. Totenkopf, with approximately 4,700 soldiers still combat-capable, led one column. They attacked westward through Soviet positions in darkness, hoping confusion would allow escape. It didn't. Soviet forces, expecting breakout attempts, had prepared defensive lines. As German columns emerged from the city, Soviet artillery and machine guns opened fire. The massacre was comprehensive. Columns were cut to pieces. Men were killed by thousands. Some units broke through. Initial Soviet positions only to be trapped in further encirclements. Wounded were abandoned. Discipline collapsed as retreat became rout. The breakout produced some of the war's grimmest statistics. Of 70,000 who attempted escape, approximately 700 reached German lines. 70,000 to 700, a 99.9% casualty rate. Totenkopf fared slightly better due to combat experience and unit cohesion. Of 4,700 who attempted escape, 170 made it to safety. 96.4% casualties. Everyone else died, was captured, or went missing. The Budapest breakout was effectively the destruction of the 3rd SS Division Totenkopf. They would be rebuilt. Every German formation was perpetually rebuilt with replacements. But the Budapest survivors were so few that they barely constituted a cadre. The division that had invaded France with 14,000 men, that had fought across Russia for 3 years, that had been mechanized and re-equipped and praised as elite, that division was annihilated in a single night, attempting to escape a city they should never have been ordered to defend. The massacre during the breakout had one final obscene coda. As Totenkopf's soldiers fled Budapest, they encountered Hungarian Jewish work battalions, slave laborers forced to build fortifications. The SS men, panicked and desperate, couldn't allow these Jews to be liberated by approaching Soviets. So they machine-gunned approximately 700 Jewish prisoners, leaving their bodies in snow-filled ditches. It was Totenkopf's final act in Budapest. Murder during retreat, genocide continuing even as the division itself was being destroyed. Some survivors were later identified and testified at war crimes trials about this massacre. They described it matter-of-factly as routine, just clearing up loose ends before evacuating. The concentration camp mentality persisted even at the moment of catastrophic defeat. The beast was dying, but it was killing to the last breath. And somehow, impossibly, it still wasn't over. Because in March 1945, the remnants would be rebuilt one last time for one final, futile operation. March 8, 1945. Austrian training camp near Vienna. 170 men stand in formation. They're all that remains of the 3rd SS Division Totenkopf after Budapest. 170 survivors from 7,800 trapped. They look like corpses, gaunt, traumatized, some still wearing bloody bandages from wounds received weeks ago. They have been ordered to Austria to rebuild the division. Rebuild. The word is almost funny. You can't rebuild from 170 men. But the SS will try. Within 3 weeks, this formation will be inflated to 4,000 soldiers, though calling them soldiers is generous. Most will be 15 or 16-year-old Hitler Youth conscripts with 4 weeks of training. Some will be Luftwaffe ground crew with no infantry experience. Others will be Kriegsmarine sailors from ships that no longer exist. They'll be issued whatever weapons remain in German arsenals, captured Soviet rifles, World War I French artillery, a dozen operational tanks of various makes. They'll be called Totenkopf because that's the name on the organizational chart. But they're not Totenkopf. They're ghosts wearing a dead division's insignia. And in 6 weeks, they'll be thrown into combat against Soviet forces that outnumber them 20-1. The reconstitution of destroyed divisions was standard German practice by 1945. Units existed on paper long after they'd been annihilated in reality. The 3rd SS Division Totenkopf had an establishment strength of 17,000 men. It had functioned as a coherent fighting force at perhaps 10 to 12,000 during the war. Now it was 170 traumatized survivors. But German bureaucracy demanded it remain on, the order of battle. So, personnel officers began assigning replacements, whoever was available, regardless of qualifications. The replacement pool by March 1945 consisted of children, old men, rear echelon personnel, and soldiers from dissolved units. None were SS volunteers in the original sense. Most were conscripts forced into the Waffen-SS because Germany had run out of Wehrmacht replacements. The Hitler Youth conscripts were perhaps the most tragic. These boys, aged 15 to 17, had been raised entirely under Nazi rule. They'd attended schools that taught racial ideology as fact. They'd participated in Hitler Youth programs that glorified military service and death for the Volk. They believed, with religious fervor, that Germany would still win the war through secret weapons or willpower. Being assigned to Totenkopf, a division with legendary status in SS propaganda, thrilled them. They were joining heroes. They'd helped save Germany. Their parents watched them leave for training knowing they were being sent to die. But saying that openly was defeatism, potentially punishable by execution. So parents hugged their children and told them to be brave. And the children went off to 4 weeks of abbreviated training before facing Soviet armies that had been fighting for 4 years. Equipment shortages were catastrophic. The rebuilt Totenkopf received 12 operational tanks, a mix of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and captured Soviet T-34s that German mechanics had repaired. 12 tanks. The division's establishment called for 150. Artillery consisted of 18 guns, including 6 World War I-era French 75mm pieces captured in 1940 and stored for 5 years. They had no spare parts. Ammunition was limited, perhaps 50 rounds per gun. Vehicles were a mad collection. German trucks, captured Soviet trucks, French civilian vehicles, horse-drawn wagons. The communications equipment mostly didn't work. The division had no air support because the Luftwaffe barely existed. Soldiers were issued captured Soviet rifles because German production couldn't meet demand. This was supposed to be an elite SS Panzer Division. It was actually a makeshift formation equipped with Wehrmacht leftovers. The command structure was chaos. Theodor Eicke, Totenkopf's founding commander, had been killed in February 1943 when his reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over the Soviet Union. Since then, the division had cycled through 5 different commanders. By March 1945, the position was held by SS Brigadeführer Helmuth Becker, a capable officer promoted beyond his competence. Becker understood that this rebuilt division was doomed. He'd read casualty reports. He knew Soviet forces were overwhelming, but orders were orders. The SS didn't question. They obeyed. So, Becker tried to train 4,000 teenagers and misfits into something resembling a combat unit, knowing most would be dead within weeks. His officers, the few Budapest survivors, and some transferred from other formations, did their best. But you can't create combat effectiveness in 3 weeks. You need months, ideally years, to develop unit cohesion and tactical competence. Totenkopf had days. Training focused on basics: how to fire a rifle, how to dig a foxhole, how to recognize Soviet tanks, what to do under artillery fire. Even ideology, previously central to SS Indoctrination, was abbreviated. There wasn't time for 6 hours weekly of racial lectures. The young soldiers received crash courses. Germany is fighting for survival. The Soviets will massacre prisoners, never surrender, fight to the death. It was concentration camp brutality condensed into slogans. The teenagers absorbed it eagerly. They wanted to believe in something. Nazism, with its clear villains and promised victory, provided comforting certainty. That it was delusional didn't matter. These boys needed to believe Germany would win. Otherwise, why were they being sent to die? The Budapest survivors watched the training with barely concealed despair. These traumatized veterans, who had seen the worst the Eastern Front offered, knew these children weren't ready. One SS officer, in a letter intercepted by censors, wrote, "We're training them to die, not to fight. They don't know it yet, but they will." Another described watching 16-year-olds practice grenade throwing and thinking about how similar grenades had killed his comrades at Kursk. The veterans couldn't express this openly. Defeatism was punishable by death. But they knew. The division being rebuilt wasn't a fighting force. It was a sacrifice to Hitler's refusal to admit defeat. 4,000 lives would be expended delaying the inevitable for perhaps a week. By April 1st, 1945, the rebuilt Totenkopf was declared combat ready. 4,000 men, 12 tanks, 18 guns, various vehicles, minimal ammunition. They were ordered to defensive positions in eastern Austria, tasked with blocking Soviet advance toward Vienna. It was a hopeless mission. Soviet forces in this sector numbered over 200,000 troops with 1,500 tanks. But the division moved to its assigned positions, dug in, and waited. The young soldiers were excited. Finally, their chance to prove themselves. The veterans were resigned. Here we go again. And in Berlin, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler moved symbols on maps and convinced himself that formations like Totenkopf would stop the Red Army through willpower alone. It was lunacy. But it was Nazi lunacy, and it had infected an entire nation. So, 4,000 soldiers, most of them children, prepared to fight a losing battle for a lost cause. The Totenkopf that existed in April 1945 bore almost no relation to the division that had invaded France 5 years earlier. Of the original 14,000 men who'd crossed into Belgium in May 1940, perhaps six men, were still alive and still with the division. Everyone else was dead, captured, transferred, or discharged wounded. Even the France rebuilt division of 1942 was 95% casualties. The name Totenkopf remained. The death's head insignia remained. The organizational structure, on paper, remained, but the essence was gone. It was a ghost division, wearing a famous name like a poorly fitting costume, staffed by ghosts who didn't know they were already dead. In a rational military, this formation would have been disbanded, its survivors distributed to other units, its equipment given to formations with better prospects. But Germany in 1945 wasn't rational. It was a death cult, burning itself out in a final paroxysm of violence. And Totenkopf, that division forged in concentration camps and baptized in war crimes, would burn with it. April 16, 1945. Eastern Austria, near the town of Steyr. Soviet artillery begins the bombardment at dawn. For 30 minutes, shells rain down on Totenkopf positions dug into Austrian hillsides. The young SS soldiers, most of whom have never experienced real combat, huddle in their foxholes and pray. Some pray to survive, others pray for courage. A few pray that the secret weapons Hitler promised will arrive. None of those prayers will be answered. When the barrage ends, Soviet tanks and infantry attack. The rebuilt Totenkopf, 4,000 soldiers with 12 operational tanks, faces the Soviet 4th Guards Army. 60,000 troops, 400 tanks, overwhelming artillery. The battle lasts 6 hours. By afternoon, Totenkopf has been shattered. Half the division is dead or wounded. The survivors retreat westward, abandoning equipment, fleeing toward American lines. This retreat will continue for 3 weeks, and at the end, on May 8, 1945, whatever remains of Totenkopf will surrender. The Death's Head Division, which terrorized Europe for 5 years, will end not in heroic last stand, but in scattered surrender to soldiers who'd never heard of them. The final campaign was pure desperation. Soviet forces were driving westward toward Vienna and beyond, racing to capture as much Austria as possible before Germany collapsed completely. German resistance was fragmentary. Some units fought hard, others surrendered immediately. Most dissolved without orders. Totenkopf, despite its name and history, was no different from other German formations by April 1945. They were undertrained, under-equipped, and increasingly unwilling to die for a regime whose defeat was obvious. The Hitler Youth conscripts, so enthusiastic during training, discovered that ideology doesn't stop bullets. The veterans, who had survived years of combat, weren't willing to throw their lives away in Austria when Berlin was already falling. So, Totenkopf fought when attacked, retreated when possible, and increasingly disintegrated as discipline collapsed. The battle on April 16th was a massacre. Soviet forces, experienced and overwhelming, destroyed Totenkopf's defensive positions in hours. The division's 12 tanks were knocked out within the first hour. Outnumbered 30-1, their crews didn't stand a chance. German infantry, most of them teenagers, fought from foxholes until killed or forced to retreat. Soviet artillery, vastly superior to anything Totenkopf possessed, systematically demolished German positions. By mid-afternoon, the division had suffered 1,800 casualties, 45% of its strength, and gained nothing. This was what combat looked like in 1945. German units being erased by materially superior Soviet forces. All the tactical skill, all the ideological fanaticism, All the legendary reputation meant nothing when you're outnumbered 20-1 with no air support, no artillery, and no hope of sea. Reinforcement. The retreat westward, April 17 through early May, was chaotic and increasingly directionless. Totenkopf, now reduced to perhaps 2,200 combat-effective soldiers, withdrew through Austria ahead of Soviet forces. They were moving west deliberately, not toward Vienna, which was encircled, but toward American lines. By late April, everyone knew the war was ending. Hitler was rumored dead. Berlin was surrounded. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose, but what would happen to German soldiers when they surrendered. And here, the SS faced unique terror. They knew how they'd treated Soviet prisoners, knew the atrocities they'd committed. Surrendering to Soviets meant probable execution or slow death in Siberian camps. Surrendering to Americans meant prisoner of war camps, eventual release, survival. So, the remnants of Totenkopf, like tens of thousands of other SS men, fled westward toward American forces. May 1st through 5th saw the division begin, destroying evidence. Orders came down from SS headquarters. Burn all records, eliminate anything connecting soldiers to war crimes. Totenkopf had been meticulous about maintaining operational records. Unit diaries, after-action reports, personnel files. Now, all of it was burned. Men who'd worn the Death's Head insignia for years began removing it, claiming they were actually Wehrmacht soldiers forced into the SS. SS tattoos, blood-type markings all SS men received, were crudely removed with knives or hidden under bandages. It was desperate self-preservation. These men knew what they'd done. They knew that captured SS men faced investigation for war crimes. So, they tried to erase their identity, to become generic German soldiers rather than Death's Head troops. Some succeeded, many didn't. Soviet and American investigators would spend years identifying SS personnel who tried to hide. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. But Totenkopf is still in the field, still armed, still retreating. The division, now perhaps 1,600 men, is near Steyr in Upper Austria. Soviet forces are approaching from the east. American forces are approaching from the west. The choice is obvious. Surrender to the Americans. Throughout May 8th and 9th, Totenkopf's soldiers approach American positions, the 3rd U.S. Army, and attempt surrender. The American response is complicated. U.S. policy was to accept surrenders from regular Wehrmacht troops, but to detain SS personnel for investigation. Many Americans didn't distinguish between different SS formations, didn't know that Totenkopf was particularly criminal or that Leibstandarte had different history. To American soldiers, SS was SS. So, Totenkopf members were processed as POWs, though held separately from Wehrmacht prisoners. Approximately 1,600 Totenkopf soldiers surrendered to American forces near Steyr between May 8th and 10th. Another estimated 400 fled into the east. Austrian civilian population, hiding their identities and attempting to disappear. Perhaps 200 were captured by Soviet forces. Their fate is unknown, but probably execution or death in captivity. The rest, roughly 800, were dead or missing from the final weeks of fighting. So, the division that had numbered 14,000 in May 1940, that had been rebuilt to 16,000 in June 1942, that had fought from France to Leningrad to Budapest, ended as perhaps 1,600 prisoners and a few hundred fugitives scattered across Austria. It was an ignoble end for a formation that had cultivated mythic status. No last stand, no fighting to the death, just scattered surrender to foreign armies and desperate attempts to avoid consequences. The American processing of Totenkopf pubs was bureaucratic and incomplete. U.S. forces were overwhelmed. Millions of German soldiers were surrendering simultaneously across Austria and southern Germany. The Americans had neither the personnel nor the facilities to conduct thorough investigations. So, captured SS men were questioned briefly. Name, rank, unit. Did you commit war crimes? Most lied. They claimed to be Wehrmacht, or if they admitted SS membership, they claimed never to participate in atrocities. Some Americans, particularly those who had liberated concentration camps and were looking for perpetrators, investigated more thoroughly. Others simply processed POWs quickly and moved on. The result was that many Totenkopf members avoided justice. They spent months in POW camps, were released in 1946 or 47, and returned to civilian life without ever being charged. But some faced consequences. British investigators were pursuing the Les Paradis massacre from May 1940. Fritz Knöchlein, who'd commanded the unit that killed 97 British prisoners, was identified and arrested in January 1946. Soviet investigators compiled lists of suspected war criminals from captured documents and survivor testimony. 27 Totenkopf members were eventually tried by Soviet courts for massacres in Ukraine and Russia. Most were executed. Others died in captivity. Western allies conducted the Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings, prosecuting high-ranking SS officers. Several Totenkopf officers were investigated, though most escaped prosecution due to lack of evidence. The document destruction in May 1945 had been partially successful. The division's end revealed a cruel irony. The concentration camp guards who had become soldiers had, in the end, become fugitives. They had spent 5 years as predators. Now they were prey, hiding from justice, terrified of consequences, dependent on American mercy they'd never shown others. Some expressed remorse in letters to families, though whether this was genuine or self-serving is unknowable. Most remained ideologically committed Nazis, bitter about defeat, convinced they'd been betrayed by weak leadership. Very few expressed understanding of what they'd done. The concentration camp mentality persisted even in defeat. They saw themselves as victims, misunderstood warriors who'd done unpleasant but necessary work. That this work included genocide was rationalized or denied. The beast was dead, but the beast didn't think it had done anything wrong. July 3rd, 1945, Les Paradis, France. British war crimes investigators stand in a meadow behind a barn. The grass grows lush now, watered by rain and blood that soaked into the soil 5 years ago. This is where 97 British soldiers were machine-gunned by SS troops in May 1940. The investigators have interviewed survivors, Private Albert Pooley and Private William O'Callaghan, who somehow lived through the massacre. They have examined the burial site, counted the bodies, matched them to missing soldiers. Now they're building a case against SS Hauptsturmführer Fritz Knöchlein, commander of the SS unit that conducted the execution. The evidence is overwhelming. Survivor testimony, forensic analysis, German documents captured intact. Knöchlein will be tried, convicted, and hanged. Justice in this case will be served. But Les Paradis was one massacre among thousands. Totenkopf committed atrocities across France, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, Austria. Most will never be investigated. Most perpetrators will never be identified. The reckoning will be incomplete. Because how do you prosecute an entire division for 5 years of continuous genocide? The pursuit of Totenkopf war criminals began immediately after Germany's surrender. British forces were particularly motivated. The Les Paradis massacre had killed British soldiers. French authorities wanted justice for massacres in France. Soviet investigators were compiling evidence of Eastern Front atrocities. American forces, having liberated concentration camps, were determined to prosecute SS personnel, but the scale was overwhelming. Totenkopf had rotated perhaps 40 to 50,000 men through its ranks during the war, counting transfers, replacements, wounded returned to duty. Of those, roughly 30,000 were dead by May 1945. Of the 20,000 survivors, perhaps 5,000 had committed identifiable war crimes, but identifying them was nearly impossible. The division had burned most records. Many perpetrators had hidden their identities. Witnesses were dead or scattered, and the Allied investigative apparatus was understaffed and overwhelmed. The Les Paradis trial, conducted in Hamburg in October 1948, was the most successful prosecution of Totenkopf crimes. Fritz Knöchlein was located living under an alias in Germany. When arrested, he initially denied involvement, then claimed he was following orders, then finally admitted giving the order to execute prisoners, but argued it was legally justified. His defense was that the British soldiers had fought in civilian clothing, false, and therefore were unlawful combatants who could be shot, also false. The prosecution presented testimony from survivors Pooley and O'Callaghan, forensic evidence from the burial site, and documents proving Knöchlein had commanded the unit. The trial lasted 11 days. Knöchlein was convicted and sentenced to death. On January 28, 1949, he was hanged at Hameln Prison. Justice was served, but it was justice for 97 dead among tens of thousands. Soviet prosecutions were more extensive and less concerned with legal niceties. Between 1945 and 1949, Soviet authorities conducted trials in Minsk, Kiev, Kharkov, and other cities. These were show trials designed to demonstrate Soviet justice and German criminality. Defendants were typically denied effective counsel, proceedings were conducted in Russian without adequate translation, evidence was sometimes fabricated or exaggerated. But in the case of Totenkopf defendants, the core charges were usually accurate. These men had participated in massacres. 27 Totenkopf members were convicted in Soviet courts. 11 were executed publicly. 16 received prison sentences ranging from 15 years to life. Most of those imprisoned died in Soviet labor camps. Whether from harsh conditions, deliberate mistreatment, or execution is unclear. Soviet records are incomplete, but the practical result was that Totenkopf members tried by Soviets generally didn't survive. Western prosecutions were more limited. The Nuremberg trials focused on high-ranking Nazis, Hitler's inner circle, Wehrmacht generals, SS leadership. Few Totenkopf members were senior enough to merit prosecution at Nuremberg, but subsequent trials, conducted by American, British, and French authorities in occupied Germany, did investigate some Totenkopf crimes. Approximately 200 Totenkopf members were investigated for war crimes between 1945 and 1950. Of those, 42 were formally tried. 31 were convicted. Sentences ranged from 5 years to life imprisonment. Only 11, including Knochlein, were executed. The rest served partial sentences and were released by the mid-1950s. This relatively light reckoning reflected several factors: lack of evidence, Cold War priorities shifting away from denazification, German pressure to end prosecutions, and simple war fatigue. By 1950, Western publics wanted to move on. The vast majority of Totenkopf members were never investigated. Approximately 20,000 men survived the war. Perhaps 200 were prosecuted, 1%. The remaining 19,800 returned to civilian life without facing justice. Some became businessmen, some became teachers, some continued military careers in post-war German armed forces. A few became politicians. They lived normal lives, raised families, collected pensions. Many joined HIAG, Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, a veterans organization that worked to rehabilitate the Waffen-SS's reputation. HIAG published memoirs and histories portraying Waffen-SS divisions as ordinary soldiers fighting for Germany, not as ideological warriors complicit in genocide. Totenkopf veterans contributed to these publications, describing battles and camaraderie while omitting massacres and atrocities. This rehabilitation effort was remarkably successful. By the 1960s, many Germans had accepted the narrative that Wehrmacht fought honorably while SS committed crimes. But even SS veterans deserved rehabilitation because they'd fought bravely. Totenkopf veterans emphasized their combat record, the battles at Kursk, the defense of Budapest, the fighting retreats, while ignoring or minimizing their crimes. When confronted with evidence of atrocities, common responses were, "I never saw anything like that. Those were isolated incidents by bad individuals. We were fighting partisans who didn't wear uniforms. The Eastern Front was brutal on both sides." These rationalizations, repeated for decades, allowed former SS men to avoid moral reckoning. They'd been soldiers. Soldiers fight. Terrible things happen in war. Move on. The victim's perspective received less attention. Soviet survivors who testified about Totenkopf massacres were dismissed in the West as communist propagandists. Ukrainian witnesses to village burnings were ignored because the Cold War made Soviet sources suspect. French civilian testimonies about massacres near Le Paradis were documented but not widely publicized. The British dead at Le Paradis were honored, but the tens of thousands of Soviet and Eastern European victims were forgotten or deliberately marginalized. Western historiography, influenced by Cold War politics, focused on Western Allied experiences and Wehrmacht operations while treating the Eastern Front as secondary. This meant Totenkopf's worst crimes, the genocide in Ukraine and Russia, received minimal attention for decades. Only in the 1980s and 90s, after Soviet archives opened, and historians like Helmut Krausnick published comprehensive studies, did the full scope of Totenkopf's criminality become clear. Researchers documented approximately 60,000 civilian deaths directly attributable to the division: massacres, village burnings, anti-partisan operations that targeted civilians, execution of POWs, support for Holocaust operations in occupied territories. 60,000, and that's a conservative estimate based on documented incidents. The actual toll is likely higher. Totenkopf was not an anomaly. Other SS divisions committed similar atrocities, but Totenkopf, with its concentration camp origins and consistent brutality across 5 years, represents the SS system at its worst. Military effectiveness, inseparable from genocide. The question of justice remains unresolved. Can partial prosecution, 200 investigations, 31 convictions, constitute justice for 60,000 dead? Can allowing 19,000 perpetrators to live normal lives be considered acceptable? The legal answer might be yes. You can only prosecute those against whom you have evidence. But the moral answer is clearly no. Totenkopf committed industrial-scale murder, and most perpetrators escaped consequences. They died in their beds, surrounded by families who often never knew what they'd done. The victims died in meadows, burned villages, execution pits, and starving in camps. The asymmetry is grotesque, but it's also reality. War crimes prosecution requires evidence, witnesses, functioning legal systems. Many Totenkopf crimes had no surviving witnesses because the perpetrators killed everyone. How do you prosecute massacres when all the victims are dead? You can't. So, justice failed, and the Yisul. Survivors, those few Totenkopf veterans who lived into old age, carried their secrets and their guilt, if they felt guilt, to their graves. The reckoning was incomplete. It always would be. October 12, 1994. A retirement home in Bavaria, Germany. An old man, aged 75, is dying. His family surrounds him. Children, grandchildren, none of whom know their father, and grandfather was SS. He never told them. For 50 years, he kept that secret. He was Totenkopf, joined in 1942, fought at Kursk, survived Budapest, surrendered to Americans. He came home, became an accountant, raised a family, normal life. Except he wasn't normal. He'd participated in massacres in Ukraine. He'd watched villages burn. He'd shot prisoners, and he never told anyone. His wife suspected but never asked. His children grew up thinking their father had been Wehrmacht. Now, hours from death, morphine loosening his tongue, he starts talking about the death's head, division, about things he did, about things he saw. His daughter, horrified, tries to stop him. His son records it on cassette tape, thinking this confession is delirium. But it's not delirium, it's memory. This man, like thousands of Totenkopf veterans, lived a double life. Respectable citizen on the surface, war criminal in the past. He dies that afternoon. The family, shattered, debates what to do with the tape. They eventually give it to historians. It becomes evidence. One more document in the endless catalog of Totenkopf crimes. One more voice from hell, recorded in a German retirement home 50 years too late. The Totenkopf legacy is complex, contested, and instructive. From one perspective, they were among the most effective military formations in World War II. Their combat record, the battles they fought, the losses they inflicted, their ability to operate under desperate conditions, was objectively impressive. Military historians studying the Eastern Front note, Totenkopf's tactical competence, defensive mastery, and unit cohesion maintained through catastrophic attrition. From this narrow military perspective, they succeeded. They did what combat divisions are supposed to do: fight effectively, hold ground, inflict casualties. Wehrmacht commanders, despite despising the SS politically, requested Totenkopf for critical missions because they performed. This combat effectiveness is historical fact. Denying it serves no purpose. But from every moral perspective, Totenkopf was a criminal organization whose military competence made them more dangerous, not less. The division participated in massacres of 60,000 plus civilians. They executed 15,000 plus prisoners of war. They destroyed 400 plus villages. They implemented genocidal policies across occupied territories. They were not soldiers who occasionally committed crimes. They were an organization whose structure, culture, and ideology systematically produced criminality. The concentration camp origins weren't incidental, they were foundational. Theodor Eicke deliberately created a formation that would combine military effectiveness with ideological ruthlessness. He succeeded. Totenkopf could fight brilliantly and murder civilians in the same operation. The skills reinforced each other. Men who could burn villages without emotion could defend positions without mercy. The brutality that made them war criminals made them effective soldiers. This duality creates historical and ethical dilemmas. How do we remember organizations that were simultaneously competent and evil? Military historians want to study Totenkopf's tactics, how they coordinated combined arms, how they conducted mobile defense, how they maintained cohesion under catastrophic casualties. These are legitimate historical questions. But studying Totenkopf's combat effectiveness without acknowledging their genocide creates false narrative. You can't separate the military history from the criminal history. They're the same history. The Panzerkeil tactics that destroyed Soviet tank formations were employed by men who'd spent the previous day executing villagers. The defensive mastery during the 1943 retreat was practiced by a division simultaneously implementing scorched earth genocide. Any analysis that treats military operations separately from atrocities fundamentally misunderstands what Totenkopf was. The post-war mythology promoted by HIAG and other veterans organizations deliberately severed this connection. They published histories emphasizing battles and heroism while minimizing or denying crimes. Books with titles like The Totenkopf Division, A Soldier's Story, portrayed the division as ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. They admitted the war was terrible, that both sides committed excesses, but framed Totenkopf as fundamentally honorable soldiers who sometimes witnessed or participated in regrettable incidents. This narrative was false, but it was pervasive. For decades, many Germans accepted it. Even some Western historians, particularly during the Cold War, repeated it. The rationale was that demonizing all German soldiers was unfair, that Wehrmacht and even Waffen-SS included conscripts who had no choice, that individual soldiers shouldn't be judged for systemic crimes. This rehabilitation narrative collapsed when historians gained access to Soviet archives in the 1990s. The documentary evidence was overwhelming. Totenkopf's crimes were not isolated incidents, but systemic policy. Mass graves across Ukraine and Russia contained victims killed by Totenkopf units. Soviet investigation files, dismissed as propaganda during the Cold War, proved largely accurate. German documents, including some Totenkopf records that survived the May 1945 burning, confirmed the division's participation in anti-partisan operations that deliberately targeted civilians. Survivor testimonies, collected over decades, provided consistent accounts of Totenkopf brutality. By the early 2000s, scholarly consensus was clear. Totenkopf was a criminal organization whose members were complicit in genocide. The mythology had been demolished by evidence. But the legacy remains contested in certain circles. Neo-Nazi and far-right groups across Europe and North America have appropriated Totenkopf imagery. The death's head symbol appears on flags, tattoos, websites. These groups lionize Totenkopf as supposed warriors against Jewish Bolshevism and white genocide. They repeat the HIAG mythology. Totenkopf were misunderstood heroes, brave soldiers fighting for Europe against communism, victims of Allied propaganda. This neo-Nazi appropriation is historically illiterate and morally repugnant, but it's also revealing. Totenkopf's legacy provides a warning about how militarism, nationalism, and racial ideology combine to produce catastrophic violence. The division didn't emerge spontaneously. It was created deliberately by a regime that valued military effectiveness and racial purity over human rights and international law. Modern military ethics education uses Totenkopf as a case study in institutional criminality. How does a military formation become genocidal? The answer isn't simple. Totenkopf combines several factors: concentration camp origins that normalized brutality, ideological indoctrination that dehumanized designated enemies, leadership that encouraged ruthlessness, combat trauma that corroded empathy, bureaucratic language that obscured moral reality, anti-partisan operations instead of village massacres, and institutional protection that eliminated consequences. No single factor explains Totenkopf. But together, they created an organization where genocide became routine, where men could kill civilians and return to normal life without apparent psychological crisis. This is the warning. Institutional evil is often banal, practiced by ordinary people following procedures within systems that reward brutality. The historical judgment is unambiguous. The 3rd SS Division Totenkopf was a criminal organization responsible for mass murder on continental scale. Their military effectiveness doesn't mitigate their criminality, it aggravates it. They weren't incompetent monsters who stumbled into atrocities. They were competent professionals who systematically implemented genocide while executing sophisticated military operations. This makes them more culpable, not less. And the fact that most perpetrators escape justice makes their legacy more troubling, not less. Totenkopf represents a possibility that every military organization must guard against. The transformation of soldiers into murderers, of professional competence into genocide. For the victims and survivors, Totenkopf's legacy is simpler and more personal. They were the people who murdered my family. They burned my village. They shot my neighbors. For survivors, scattered across Eastern Europe, the death's head symbol doesn't represent military prowess or historical complexity. It represents terror, loss, and injustice. These people watched their relatives die. Many waited decades for justice that never came. They testified at trials, provided evidence, identified perpetrators, and watched most of them escape consequences. The historical debates about Totenkopf's military effectiveness, the scholarly analyses of their tactics, the discussions of institutional criminality, all of this, to survivors, misses the fundamental truth. These were murderers who got away with murder. As the last Totenkopf survivors die, as the last Holocaust survivors die, as the generation with living memory of World War II disappears, the question becomes, how will history remember them? Will we remember Totenkopf primarily as effective soldiers or as war criminals? The answer matters because it shapes how we understand military organizations, nationalism, and genocide. If we emphasize their combat effectiveness, we risk glorifying a criminal organization. If we acknowledge only their crimes, we risk failing to understand how such organizations emerge and function. The complete history requires holding both truths simultaneously. Totenkopf was militarily effective and morally monstrous. Their competence made them more dangerous. Their ideological commitment made them complicit in genocide. And their legacy warns us that professional military organizations, when coupled with dehumanizing ideology and freed from legal constraints, can become instruments of systematic murder. The death's head symbol still appears occasionally, on flags at far-right rallies, tattooed on white supremacists, reproduced in video games and movies as shorthand for evil. Each appearance demonstrates that Totenkopf's legacy persists. But that legacy isn't what its veterans wanted. They wanted to be remembered as brave soldiers who fought impossible battles under desperate circumstances. Instead, history remembers them accurately, as war criminals whose military skill made their crimes more devastating. There's no rehabilitation, no redemption, no reclaiming their reputation. The concentration camp guards who became soldiers, who were mechanized and sent to conquer Europe, who fought brilliantly and murdered routinely, they're remembered for both. And the judgment is final. They were, from beginning to end, servants of genocide wearing soldiers' uniforms. The beast died in Austria in May 1945, but its shadow stretches forward through decades, a permanent warning about what military organizations become when ideology replaces ethics, when effectiveness supersedes morality, and when ordinary men decide that following orders justifies any atrocity. That warning is Totenkopf's only useful legacy, and we ignore it at our peril.